In the still of the night, the chime of an ancient clock tower echoed through the darkness, as if signaling a moment of great importance. A mysterious man walked quietly across the stone steps of the vast mansion, his dry footsteps breaking the silence of the night. On a high, windswept balcony, a girl with striking pink hair stood lost in thought, staring blankly into the void. A young man approached and softly called her name, Vivian, startling her out of her private thoughts. Vivian turned around, her face full of astonishment at the unexpected arrival of someone she knew. She broke into a bright smile at once and greeted Lord Villainess with warmth, as though he were an old friend. Villainess looked puzzled, wondering what serious matter could have brought her out here at this hour. Vivian hesitated before asking if he had heard about what had just happened at tonight's royal banquet. He confirmed he already knew about the Crown Prince's proposal, and Vivian admitted that was exactly why she was troubled. She begged him to help her find a truly trustworthy man, right then and there. Villainess was stunned by her request to find her a husband, while Vivian stressed it had to be a foreign nobleman. She explained she needed to marry or at least get engaged immediately to escape the Crown Prince's relentless pursuit. Vivian revealed she hoped to find someone willing to enter a contract marriage lasting exactly 1 year. Villainess suddenly grew tense, demanding to know if she truly intended to make that kind of deal with some other man. He reminded her that she had once promised to stay by his side forever, leaving her utterly confused, since she had no idea what he meant. Villainess abruptly seized her hand, and the boldness of it made Vivian cry out in shock. He leaned in close and reminded her that she was the one who had said she wanted to marry him, leaving her bewildered as to when she had ever said such a thing. Vivian racked her brain, trying to recall when she might have let something like that slip, but she couldn't remember at all. Seeing the hurt in Villainess's eyes, Vivian felt like the worst kind of person, one who toys with someone's feelings. Flustered, she insisted firmly that she had never said any such thing. Confused by Villainess's strange reaction, Vivian couldn't help but wonder why he was suddenly acting so odd. In truth, as Vivian looked at him, she saw another face layered over Villainess's, the only person she had ever sworn to stay with for life. In a distant memory, 2 children had promised to meet again, no matter how long they might be apart. Vivian was stunned to realize the unbelievable truth that Lord Villainess was actually Rachel, while he still firmly demanded an answer from her. He laced his fingers through hers and declared that if the 2 of them married, they would always be able to hold hands just like this. Remembering that Rachel was supposed to be the villainess of the story, Vivian asked in confusion if he could really do this with someone else, even as her mind screamed in bewilderment. She was utterly devastated to realize the person she'd seen as her closest friend all this time was actually a man, and it felt like nothing short of a shameless con. The story rewound 10 years to when Vivian, having just survived a violent fever that nearly killed her, suddenly realized she had been transported into a novel she had read in her past life, and she was thrown into a panic over her situation. In the original story, she was Vivian, the female lead born into a poor commoner family. And the male lead of the entire tale was none other than Crown Prince Alain, a man of great power. As lucky as it might sound to be loved by a crown prince, the truth of it was anything but pleasant for her. That novel ended in tragedy, with the heroine dying of illness and leaving Alain drowning in belated regret. Vivian was furious to realize she now carried that very same incurable disease within her. The illness, called mana overload, caused a massive buildup of mana that pressed down on her heart. If left untreated, that massive mana would eventually explode, a truly horrifying and agonizing death. Even so, she saw a flicker of hope shining through this unfortunate fate. Vivian believed there was still a way for her to save herself and escape the tragic ending that had already been written. She realized there was only one person in the world who could help cure her of this incurable illness. That was Rachel Eady, the most feared villainess in the entire novel. Rachel was no ordinary villainess fighting over romance. She was a true antagonist with ambitions of seizing the throne itself. Unlike Vivian, who suffered from an excess of mana, Rachel possessed the unique ability to absorb mana from her surroundings. In the original story, Vivian had refused Rachel's help in order to protect Alain, but now she saw just how foolish that had been. Vivian no longer cared about the plot or the male lead's regrets. All she wanted was to survive. She decided she would cling to Rachel with everything she had, in order to live a long, healthy life. Vivian even confidently planned to keep Rachel from falling into darkness, believing it was a win-win idea for them both. Filled with determination, little Vivian set out on her journey to find Rachel, no matter what it took. Her destination was the magnificent, imposing mansion of the Edie family. Standing before the mansion gates, she watched intently as the servants bustled about with their work. Vivian understood that to reach Rachel, the Duke's only daughter, she would first need to make herself known in a natural way. Being a mere commoner, she couldn't just barge in to meet her, so she had prepared a different approach. Her greatest goal was to change that tragic ending so she could survive. The first step of her plan was to befriend the servants in order to gather information about Rachel and the Duke's family. Sensing the moment was right, Vivian decided to act at once. Without a moment's hesitation, the little girl cheerfully ran up to greet the group of servants working outside the mansion. Though they seemed rather cold and guarded at first, Vivian figured that was only natural and pressed on with introducing herself. She introduced herself as Vivian, age 9, daughter of the owner of the well-known Vivi Bakery in the village. Vivian chattered brightly that since she'd noticed they had just moved in, she'd come by out of curiosity about the huge mansion. She eagerly told them to feel free to ask her anything about the village, since she'd lived there her whole life. The little girl even let them in on a secret: a rosewater sold at the town square that worked wonders for softening skin. At the mention of this beauty trick, one of the maids was instantly hooked and pressed her eagerly for the price. Vivian silently cheered inside, delighted that she'd successfully caught their attention. She quoted a price and threw in a bonus tip: that old Pierre's Inn served some really excellent wine. A guard teased her, asking how a kid like her would know good wine. Vivian explained that an old man who drank there often had told her all about it. She even imitated the old man's expression as he vowed to quit drinking the very next day, only to be back at it again the day after. Vivian's funny story had everyone laughing heartily, and they all wanted to go check out that tavern for themselves. Vivian smiled with satisfaction, seeing that the ice-breaking was going remarkably well. Another man came over and asked the little girl if she knew a good place to buy quality cheese, since he wanted to go pick some up. Vivian puffed out her chest with confidence, assuring him she knew this area like the back of her hand, and telling him to trust her completely. After saying her goodbyes to everyone, the little girl toddled off home, not forgetting to promise she'd see them again tomorrow. She chuckled to herself with satisfaction, thinking the results of her first day had exceeded even her own expectations. Though a little disappointed she hadn't gotten to see Rachel with her own eyes yet, Vivian remained optimistic about her plan. She reminded herself there was still plenty of time to carry everything out. On her way home, Vivian suddenly stopped short at the sight of a small figure standing by a window high above. She was stunned to recognize that silhouette as none other than Rachel, the very girl she'd been longing to meet. Rachel's image appeared in her mind more vivid and real than ever before. Vivian couldn't help but marvel at the almost otherworldly beauty of the girl standing up there. She was utterly captivated by Rachel's stunning looks, tinged with a cold and mysterious air. Snapping out of her daze, Vivian reminded herself this was no time to be standing around in a stupor. She quickly waved with great enthusiasm, but Rachel merely stared down at her in silence. To her utter surprise, Rachel coldly turned away and slammed the window shut, leaving Vivian standing there dumbfounded. Vivian felt a bit deflated, worrying that her behavior at their first meeting might have come across as too much, and that it had put Rachel off. But she quickly picked herself back up, telling herself that at the very least, she'd managed to make herself known to Rachel. She congratulated herself for having brilliantly accomplished the goals she'd set for the day. The next day, just as she'd promised, Vivian led one of the mansion's staff to buy cheese at a shop in the village. The cheese shop owner panicked upon hearing that nobility would be eating his goods, and he grew too nervous to sell. Vivian used her little tricks to win over the stubborn old Gerald, successfully securing a contract to supply cheese to the mansion. The servant thanked Vivian sincerely, while the little girl told him he should just call her by her first name from now on to be more familiar. Vivian smiled with a hidden purpose, silently calculating that her next step was to get him to help her get inside the mansion. She began putting on an act, feigning stomach pain, which got the servant worried and asking after her. She complained that walking so far had probably made her both hungry and tired. Vivian's stomach let out a loud, deliberate growl, startling the servant. The little girl pretended to trudge off home, all the while thinking he surely wouldn't have the heart to let a hungry child walk home alone. Just as she'd predicted, the servant hurried after her, calling out to stop her. He warmly invited her inside the mansion for a light snack before heading home. Vivian happily nodded in agreement right away, and just like that, Her plan to get inside the mansion had succeeded brilliantly. Vivian delightedly devoured every last bit of the cream cake and cheerfully thanked everyone for their warm hospitality. The little girl sat eating happily, surrounded by the mansion's servants in the cozy kitchen. A maid asked for her name and eagerly invited Vivian to see the mansion's beautiful garden later, and the little girl nodded along at once. While one servant remarked how the place was as splendid as a palace fit for a princess, another chimed in that there really was an ice princess living there. Vivian suddenly recalled seeing a strikingly beautiful person on the third floor the day before, and she grew curious about what the Duke's daughter was really like. Just then, a brown-haired girl came storming into the room with an air of arrogance, loudly demanding more cake. Startled to see a stranger in the kitchen, the girl froze in place, her face a mix of shock and irritation. She immediately pointed at Vivian, demanding to know who she was and how she dared to be there, ignoring the servant's explanation that this was a guest who had helped them. When the servant suggested the two girls become friends, this girl, Sally, sneered and showed no interest whatsoever in cooperating. She laughed mockingly at the very idea of having to play with a lowly country bumpkin like Vivian. Vivian was bewildered, wondering who this girl even was, since as far as she remembered, the only family member here was her grandfather, Duke Edie. Sally shrieked, scolding everyone for daring to bring a filthy beggar in from the market into the Duke's manor. One maid, unable to hold back any longer, stood up to intervene, feeling Sally had gone too far, but the girl still stubbornly refused to ever befriend such a filthy child. Sally furiously ordered everyone around her to throw Vivian out at once. Suddenly, an authoritative voice rang out, demanding to know what all the commotion was about, and Sally froze in fear. Vivian turned around and saw that the person who had just appeared carried an invisible pressure and an entirely different air about him. It was none other than Lord Cant Edie, the powerful Duke and true master of the mansion. Sally hurried to tattle to the Duke that Vivian had trespassed into the mansion uninvited, which made the little girl feel this girl was truly troublesome and unpleasant. Vivian quickly calculated that if she could make a good impression on the Duke right now, she'd have a golden chance to meet Rachel in person. When the Duke asked who had brought this child in, James nervously stepped forward to take responsibility, his face full of worry. James explained that Vivian had helped him find cheese to buy, so he'd invited her in for a snack, which left the Duke rather surprised. The Duke couldn't believe that such an ordinary-looking child as Vivian could negotiate prices as skillfully and professionally as James described. Vivian politely performed a curtsy and introduced herself as the daughter of Diaz Hessin before the noble lord. The little girl boldly asked for permission to explain herself, and received the Duke's curious consent. The Duke silently realized Vivian was using clever words to stop him from punishing James for the mistake of letting a stranger inside. Vivian thought to herself that if the Duke threw her out and punished James, he would become a man who disregarded principle and failed to reward those who had done him a service. Impressed by the little girl's wit beyond her years, the Duke ordered his steward Owen to prepare food and a fitting reward for Vivian's efforts. Sally, utterly displeased, shouted, demanding to know why the Duke would reward this lowly child instead of tossing her out. The Duke coldly reminded Sally that mistreating a benefactor of the Edie family was against all principle, and asked pointedly if she dared to object to his decision. Vivian bowed her head in thanks and skillfully promised she would find every way possible to repay the Duke's kindness in the future. The Duke smirked to himself, wondering if this little girl was secretly planning to keep hanging around the place for good. He privately judged that this child was not only clever but also quite crafty, and figured that sharp ones like her tended to be easy to make use of. The Duke found it all quite a coincidence, since he himself needed a girl of the same age for his own plans, and Vivian happened to be the perfect piece to fit. The next morning at the family bakery, the space was filled with sunlight and the busy energy of hard work. Vivian was absorbed in sweeping the shop when she was startled to hear her father calling her name from behind. Diaz Hessin was surprised to see his daughter waking up so early for once, and he fondly teased her, calling her his little sleepyhead princess. Vivian worried quietly, since she'd been getting up early to sneak off to the mansion, and if her father ever found out she'd been sneaking there for days, she'd surely get an earful. Her father sternly warned Vivian never to go near that mansion again, and the little girl just nodded rapidly, feigning indifference. She fretted at the thought of how deafeningly he'd nag her if he found out the truth, though she still couldn't understand why that place was forbidden to her. Vivian openly declared that from now on she'd become an obedient, hard-working daughter, leaving her father unable to help but doubt this sudden change. Before she could even celebrate her plan, Vivian was startled to see her father clumsily knock over the shop's signboard. She rushed over and scolded him for being so careless with such a huge sign. Vivian worriedly checked her father's face, but he just smiled and waved it off, insisting he was fine and not hurt anywhere. When he took off his glasses, her father revealed an extremely handsome face, leaving Vivian wondering why he wore glasses at all when his eyesight wasn't even bad, since they only seemed to hurt business by making him too handsome. Vivian sighed in dismay at the sight of her father's strange purple loaves, silently declaring that his baking skills were truly a disaster. The housewives in the village stopped by and showered Vivian with praise for being such a devoted daughter, always helping her father sell every day. The moment her father greeted them, the ladies all instantly blushed, and Vivian understood full well that the shop only stayed afloat because of her father's looks. The little girl thought regretfully that if her father would just give up those glasses, the shop's earnings would surely soar even higher. After making their purchases, the ladies said their goodbyes and invited Vivian to come play with them sometime when she was free. Vivian got ready to welcome the next customers, and the little girl responded cheerfully right away. Suddenly, a lavish horse-drawn carriage pulled up and came to a stop right in front of the small bakery. Both father and daughter were baffled as to why such a grand carriage would show up here of all places. Vivian froze as she looked closer and recognized the noble crest intricately carved on the side of the carriage. It was the emblem of the prestigious Duke Edie family, leaving the little girl thoroughly stunned. The carriage door opened and a distinguished-looking man stepped out, under the astonished gaze of Vivian and her father. Vivian recognized him at once as Steward Owen, the man who had stood by the Duke's side the day before. Owen greeted Vivian, leaving the little girl utterly puzzled as to why he would come all the way to her home like this. Her father suddenly placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder, his expression full of suspicion, and called her name in a tone that sent a chill down her spine. He looked at his daughter with fiery eyes, demanding to know since when she had come to know the steward of a great family like the Edies. Vivian was so frightened she trembled and wanted nothing more than to run, faced with her father's sudden anger. She forced the most awkward smile she could manage, stammering out a question about whether Owen had come to buy bread, hoping to change the subject. Owen smiled and said he'd come for another important matter, which only made Vivian more anxious. The air between Vivian's father and the steward grew tense as the two men faced off with wary looks. Owen solemnly introduced himself as the steward of the Duke Edie family in front of Vivian's father. After confirming that Diaz Hessen was indeed Vivian's father, Owen announced he would get straight to the point of his visit, not wanting to waste time. The steward informed them that the Duke wished to invite Vivian to become the young lady's study companion, leaving the girl utterly stunned by the news. Vivian silently cheered, amazed that such a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity had come to her so easily. Owen explained further that the Duke had come to value Vivian's special potential quite highly. After their brief encounter the day before, her father radiated a frightening aura, turning to look at Vivian as if demanding to know when exactly she had met the Duke without breathing a word of it to him. The steward promised Vivian would receive every educational privilege and support under the Edie family's name, while the little girl tried desperately to calm her furious father. Vivian silently gloated, thinking the terms were simply too good, and she felt certain her father would have no reason to turn down such a generous offer. Yet her father flatly refused the Duke's invitation, shocking Vivian so much she cried out in disbelief, unable to trust her own ears. Her father used the excuse that there was still much he hadn't finished teaching her, so Vivian wasn't yet qualified to be a companion to a noble young lady. Vivian refused to give up, doing everything she could to persuade her father not to pass up this rare chance to change their fortunes. In the end, father and daughter went inside to talk privately, determined to settle the disagreement once and for all. Her father sternly asked his daughter why she had dared to disobey him and sneak off to that mansion despite being forbidden. Vivian realized that this time, neither begging nor pleading would work against her father's firm resolve. The little girl honestly confessed that out of curiosity she had only meant to watch from outside and had accidentally run into the Duke by chance, with no intention of doing anything wrong. Her father demanded she promise never to go there again, saying he would handle everything with the steward himself. Seeing her father's unusually serious expression, Vivian grew flustered when he asked her the real reason she was so determined to go. Since she couldn't reveal the truth behind the old plot details, Vivian had to find another excuse weighty enough to convince her father. The little girl looked her father straight in the eye and clearly declared that her greatest wish right now was to be cured of her illness. This statement left her father utterly stunned, as though it had struck straight at a fear he had long carried. Her father, panicked, pulled Vivian into a tight embrace, pressing her about whether she'd been in pain lately or hiding a worsening condition from him. Vivian quickly reassured her father that she was fine and asked him to calm down so she could tell him her heartfelt wish. The little girl confided that she wanted to recover quickly so she could live a long life by his side, and she didn't want him to keep worrying about her. Vivian believed the Duke surely knew the Empire's finest doctors and mages, so this was her greatest hope of finding a way to survive. Her father fell silent for a long while in the darkness, his heart filling with an indescribable sorrow and remorse for his precious little girl. In the end, he gave a quiet nod of agreement to Vivian's decision, having come to understand her deepest wishes and her will to live. He resolved to swallow his pride and seek the Duke's help, for the sake of his daughter's future and her very life. Vivian joyfully threw her arms around her father's neck, thanking him warmly for understanding and supporting her wish. The next day, just as agreed, Vivian officially arrived at the majestic mansion of the Edie family. Steward Owen warmly welcomed her and invited her for tea in the elegant surroundings, marking the start of a promising new journey. The courteous steward asked Vivian to wait a moment while he went to fetch the young lady, and the little girl obediently agreed, her face lit up with excitement. Vivian sat alone, restless, knowing she was about to formally meet Rachel, her little heart pounding at this important moment. To prepare for the best possible first impression, she gently patted her own cheeks to make her face look fresh and radiant. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud shout aimed straight at the little girl sitting there waiting. Vivian looked up with sparkling, hopeful eyes, silently calling Rachel's name, thinking her dream friend had finally appeared. But the one who walked in was Sally, fuming as she demanded to know why Vivian had the nerve to show her face at the mansion again. Seeing the sheer fury on her opponent's face, Vivian wasn't scared in the slightest, instead flashing a smug little smirk. The little girl clearly announced she had come here as the young lady's study companion, and hoped Sally would offer her more help going forward. Sally sneered with contempt, unable to believe that a commoner child like Vivian could have won such a prestigious position. The young maid jumped up and pointed straight at her, shrieking to know who had allowed Vivian into the house without asking her mother's permission first. Vivian calmly shot back, asking whether the Duke needed her mother's permission for everything he did, leaving Sally speechless. The little girl added a taunting challenge, telling Sally to go ahead and tell her mother that the Duke had chosen a street urchin as the young lady's companion. Sally shook with rage, her face darkening as the remark hit a nerve she couldn't fight back against Vivian's sharp words. Before storming off in a huff, Sally couldn't resist throwing out a threat, while Vivian mischievously stuck out her tongue behind her back. As time slowly passed in silence, Vivian began to worry, since there was still no sign of the young lady. The little girl sat gazing blankly outside, silently hoping her admired friend would appear soon to ease her restlessness. Just then, a sudden, violent pain struck Vivian, leaving her staggering, her face pale from the agony racking her from within. The little girl realized her mana overload symptoms had chosen this exact, inopportune moment to flare up. Vivian gasped for breath, feeling as though her heart might burst from the overwhelming mana crushing her chest. The little girl told herself she absolutely could not collapse or reveal her incurable illness in this unfamiliar place. Though she knew the illness wasn't contagious, she still forced herself to stand, not wanting to draw attention or disrupt the meeting. Fearing the Duke's family would refuse to accept a sickly child as a companion, Vivian panicked and tried to find a way out of the room as quickly as possible. The little girl staggered as she fled, hoping only to find some hidden corner where she could quietly endure the agonizing pain alone. Lost in a haze of pain, Vivian accidentally crashed into someone blocking her path and could only mumble a hasty apology. The other person quickly caught her, creating a strange, frozen moment amid the quiet stillness of the hallway. When she looked up to see who it was, Vivian was stunned to realize the person standing before her was none other than Rachel. Fighting through the pain still tormenting her, Vivian introduced herself, saying that from today on she would officially be the young lady's new companion. In stark contrast to the little girl's warmth, Rachel simply stayed silent and coldly walked past, as if utterly indifferent to Vivian's presence. Vivian felt a chill run down her spine at that icy attitude, wondering if fate was turning the two of them into enemies. Suddenly, Vivian stopped short, noticing something strange happening with her own body. She was astonished to realize the crushing pain from moments ago had completely vanished the instant she touched Rachel. Vivian thought to herself that Mana pain usually lingered stubbornly, yet this time everything had eased so quickly it seemed almost unbelievable. The little girl marveled that a single light touch from Rachel had smoothly resolved the excess mana built up inside her. Overjoyed at finding a glimmer of hope for survival, Vivian let out an excited cheer, prompting Rachel, who had been reading, to glance up in confusion. With her will to survive burning even stronger now, Vivian resolved that no matter the cost, she would cling to Rachel and become her closest friend. The little girl boldly declared how much she liked the young lady, and promised she would surely bring her happiness from then on. Rachel coldly snapped her book shut and called out Vivian's name in a tone that was both stern and rather frightening. Her blunt declaration telling Vivian never to come back again hit like a bucket of cold water thrown straight at the little girl's enthusiasm. Vivian froze completely, feeling as though her heart had shattered at her dream friend's blunt, cruel rejection. Vivian sniffled, calling out the young lady's name, feeling her dream of a long, healthy life crumbling apart entirely. But the little girl quickly pulled herself together, her eyes blazing with determination not to surrender to her predetermined fate. With a spirit of unwavering persistence, she told herself that if knocking on someone's heart 10 times didn't work, she would patiently knock an 11th time. Vivian cheered herself on, telling herself to stay strong and optimistic as she continued her campaign to win over her stubborn friend. A few days later, another afternoon tea was held at the mansion, amid the endless anticipation of the pink-haired little girl. After waiting half an hour with no sign of the young lady, Vivian began to feel anxious and discouraged by the hopeless wait. Rachel's cold words that day, telling her never to come back, echoed in her mind and left the little girl feeling gloomy. Vivian's face fell as she began to fear she had truly been stood up without mercy. Just as that thought crossed her mind, the door opened and Vivian cried out with joy, thinking the person she'd been longing for had finally arrived. She was about to greet her politely, but her smile froze the moment she realized the one who had walked in was a face she found rather unpleasant. Sally strode into the room, her expression more smug and arrogant than ever in front of Vivian. She looked at Vivian with a mocking gaze, as though she already held victory and humiliation firmly in her grasp. Sally mimicked Vivian's tone mockingly, calling her a foolish little idiot who understood nothing about the world. She demanded to know why Vivian thought the young lady had paid her no mind at all this whole time. Sally taunted Vivian while relaying a cruel message, claiming the young lady found her too lowly and unworthy to play with. She told Vivian to know her place and scram home instead of standing there causing trouble for others. Vivian lowered her head thoughtfully, then asked a pointed question in return, making the room's atmosphere suddenly grow heavy and tense. She raised her head with a bright smile, declaring she would go ask the young lady herself to get to the bottom of things, rather than listen to someone else's spiteful taunts. Sally began to panic, worried that if Vivian actually met the young lady, her lies would be completely exposed. Vivian shot back, asking if Sally leaving now wouldn't just make her a disobedient child defying the Duke's own orders. Ignoring Sally's shouts to stop her, Vivian was determined to run as fast as she could deep into the mansion to find the young lady. A chaotic chase broke out down the hallway as Sally strained with all her might to catch the troublesome little girl darting away like the wind. Vivian told herself that once she'd committed to this course, she couldn't back out now, not at such a crucial moment. Her determination to see Rachel burned fiercer than ever, undeterred by all the servants' attempts to stop and threaten her. Racing up the tall staircase, Vivian suddenly froze at the sight of the familiar figure she had been searching for. Sally, having just caught up, cried out the young lady's name in a panic, her face full of fear. The young maid quickly tattled on Vivian for stubbornly insisting on seeing the young lady even after being firmly turned away before. Rachel looked at Vivian with a gaze full of surprise and confusion at her unexpected presence and this determined attitude. While Sally gloated, thinking she'd already won, Vivian secretly smiled, since she had another, far more effective card up her sleeve. Vivian pouted, feigning pity, and admitted she knew the young lady must be bored with tea time, so she wanted to suggest a fun new activity instead. Vivian's invitation to tour the village left Rachel utterly bewildered, since it was something she had never even considered before. Sally immediately jumped in to object, dismissing the village as filthy and insisting the noble young lady would never want to go outside. Knowing the original story in advance, Vivian understood that deep down, Rachel had always longed to see the world beyond the mansion. In truth, Rachel was the daughter of the late Crown Prince, who had been condemned for treason and met an utterly tragic fate. Her mother was Lady Isla, the Duke's own daughter, who had suffered greatly in the aftermath of the political upheaval. Though the Emperor couldn't openly punish Rachel, the whole empire understood she would never receive forgiveness. Because of this, Rachel had been forced to live hidden in the shadows, careful never to draw anyone's attention, just to preserve her own life. The little girl was like a ghost within the mansion, forced to conceal her very existence to escape being hunted down by her enemies. It was this excessive suppression that later turned Rachel's heart into one full of ambition and cruelty in the original story. Vivian gently reached out her hand, hoping to help her friend escape the gloomy darkness she had endured for so long. Rachel hesitated at the offer, as though her icy heart were finally beginning to stir at Vivian's sincerity. The nanny Margaret stepped in and flatly refused, insisting the outing was far too risky and unnecessary. Sally cheerfully called for her mother, while Vivian realized her true opponent right now was this strict, authoritative nanny. Margaret used her authority as the children's educational guardian to rigidly block any plans of theirs to go out and play. She insisted the young lady already had other lessons planned and couldn't go anywhere, her cold expression showing not the slightest sign of budging. Vivian privately blamed the nanny, feeling that while she meant to protect Rachel, she was far too extreme, never once considering the girl's true feelings. The little girl kept trying to negotiate, hoping to make use of the remaining tea time to take Rachel outside for some fresh air. Margaret repeated her refusal in a threatening tone so intense it would make any child tremble with fear. Undaunted, Vivian came up with the idea of going directly to the Duke himself to override the nanny's rigid stubbornness. Margaret's face turned purple with rage as she shouted that she alone held full authority here, and her wishes were the same as the Duke's own will. Just as the argument reached its peak, a deep, commanding voice belonging to the master of the mansion rang out from behind them. The Duke appeared and questioned Margaret right back, leaving her so flustered she couldn't even speak out of sheer fear. Margaret tried to defend herself by claiming she was only worried about the young lady, but the Duke coldly told her that if she was so concerned, she should simply hire more guards. He tenderly gave Rachel permission to go out with Vivian, on the sole condition that both of them return home before dark. Margaret still tried to salvage the situation with the excuse of etiquette lessons, but the Duke completely ignored her and handed full authority over to the children. The Duke instructed Steward Owen to have a carriage prepared and asked whether some of his tasks could be pushed to the next day. Vivian was thoroughly thrilled, tasting for the first time in her life the flavor of power and special privilege. Realizing that both Sally and the nanny simply wanted to get rid of her, the little girl decided it was time to take a bold, risky move. Vivian hurried after the Duke, calling out to him as she saw him climbing the tall staircase of the mansion. The little girl politely bowed and apologized for having been too busy earlier to properly greet him. The Duke reminded her that they had already met once before, but noted that this was the first time she had greeted him as her granddaughter's companion. Vivian cheekily explained that her father had always told her that when visiting a friend's home, she must properly introduce her background and behave with the utmost courtesy. With sparkling, hopeful eyes, the little girl boldly asked if she might be allowed to have dinner with the Duke that very evening. Vivian's audacious request left every servant and knight nearby utterly frozen with shock. The nanny Margaret rushed over in a panic, dragging Vivian away while scolding her as an ill-mannered commoner child and apologizing profusely to the Duke. In stark contrast to everyone else's tension, the Duke suddenly burst into hearty laughter at the little girl's boldness. He happily agreed and ordered Owen to prepare dinner to welcome this special guest, also his granddaughter's very first friend. Vivian cheered with delight, thrilled that her plan to break into the aristocratic circle had succeeded far beyond her expectations. Watching from a distance, Rachel too was left dumbfounded, unable to believe both the outing and the dinner had gone so smoothly. But right after that, Rachel suddenly changed her mind and told Vivian she would no longer go tour the village after all. Vivian jumped up in shock, demanding to know why, but the young lady simply replied coldly that she just didn't feel like going anymore. The pink-haired girl tried hard to persuade her, promising to resolve whatever was troubling Rachel if she would only tell the truth. Rachel sighed and admitted that she absolutely hated places that were loud and chaotic. The young lady of the Edie family showed clear tension as she insisted she simply couldn't handle being around crowds. Seeing Rachel's trembling hands and troubled expression, Vivian felt deep sympathy for her little friend. Vivian suddenly understood that Rachel was afraid of prying eyes and cruel gossip about being the daughter of a traitor. Rachel worried the villagers might recognize her identity and start gossiping about her family's dark past. Vivian confidently assured her she had a way to solve the young lady's fear of being judged by others. The little girl took her friend's hand and told Rachel to trust completely in her carefully thought-out arrangements. Vivian led Rachel and a group of knights to a dense forest, suggesting everyone climb a tall hill hidden from view. Noticing the knights looked tired, she teased them, asking if they'd only had a single crust of bread that day to be so weak. Vivian cheerfully promised she'd tell the Duke to give them plenty more bread so everyone could eat their fill. The knights turned pale with fear at this and scrambled to beg the little girl not to say a word to their master. In his office, the Duke sternly asked the knights whether it was true they had complained about being underfed and demanded more bread. He glared at them with intense pressure, scolding them for how the Duke's own knights could act so shamelessly as to let a child speak up for their food. Fearing an even harsher punishment, the knights hurried everyone along the road to avoid causing any more trouble. Vivian led the whole group beneath a massive old tree and announced that this was the spot where they could take in the entire view of the village from above. She called Rachel over to come admire the breathtaking scenery unfolding before them. Rachel stood in silence, gazing at the outside world she had only ever known through the cold pages of books. Vivian cheered with pride as the whole village appeared, vibrant and peaceful beneath the glow of the setting sun. Rachel gasped in astonishment, realizing the village looked far more alive and beautiful than she had ever imagined. The black-haired girl couldn't hold back her emotion, realizing she had truly stepped beyond the boundaries of the mansion to touch the world at last. Vivian suddenly rolled down the hill onto the grass below, leaving Rachel completely stunned, unsure what her friend was even doing. The pink-haired girl giggled, glancing back while still lost in the joy of rolling freely down the hillside. Vivian just kept rolling and laughing with abandon, leaving everyone with her utterly baffled by this style of play. The knights rushed after her in a panic, worried about the safety of the mischievous child hurtling down the slope like the wind. After a good long roll, Vivian's once elegant dress was now smeared with mud and dead leaves. The little girl sat up with a beaming, joyful face, declaring to everyone that this game was truly a lot of fun. Rachel approached warily, silently wondering if there could possibly be another child in the world who behaved so strangely. In Rachel's memory, every child she'd ever met in the capital had behaved with the utmost seriousness, like tiny adults. She recalled her old friends always keeping a respectful, exceedingly cautious demeanor whenever they stood before her grandfather. Rachel felt Vivian was like a wild little foal, following none of the rigid rules or etiquette that bound everyone else. Looking at her friend's carefree expression, Rachel thought Vivian truly resembled an innocent child in every sense, utterly untouched by the worries of the aristocratic world. The young lady of House Edie privately concluded that Vivian really was an extraordinarily different, somewhat eccentric friend. Rachel scolded her friend for her dirty clothes, but Vivian just laughed it off and casually brushed the dirt from her dress. Rachel watched Rachel's every lively movement in silence, her eyes filled with deep, thoughtful reflection. Vivian eagerly invited the young lady to join in, but Rachel declined, telling her friend to just go on enjoying the game herself. Despite being turned down, the pink-haired girl kept right on playing, since she found the soft grass truly comfortable and fun. The two of them stood in silence together, watching the peaceful village slowly sink into the magical dusk. Vivian eagerly pointed out to Rachel the location of the fruit shop and the general store down in the valley. She excitedly went on to describe the bookshop and the restaurants serving incredibly delicious food she'd once enjoyed. Vivian's eyes sparkled with joy as she talked about the simple yet wonderful things in the place where she was born and raised. Rachel quietly wondered how a mere commoner child could radiate such vibrant, sparkling vitality. Noticing the young lady staring at her, lost in thought, Vivian called out softly to pull her friend out of her wandering mind. The little girl happily promised that next time, the two of them would stroll through the streets together directly instead of just watching from afar like this. Rachel realized Vivian possessed a freedom and self-confidence that she herself, despite all her noble status, had never once had. To Rachel, the small child standing beside her right now seemed like the true owner of this whole vast world. Watching the sun sink slowly behind the mountains, Rachel admitted to herself that a small feeling of envy was rising within her. That mix of jealousy and admiration made the young lady's heart suddenly feel heavy under the weight of her own reality. As night finally settled in, The clatter of horse hooves rang out, carrying everyone away from the forest and back to the mansion. Riding in the carriage, Vivian curiously asked Rachel how she'd felt about the special outing she had worked so hard to arrange. Rachel kept to her habit of silence, offering no response at all to her friend's sincere question. Vivian thought to herself that the young lady was still as prickly as ever, even though she'd deliberately chosen a quiet, deserted place to please her friend as best she could. Rachel suddenly reached out and gently touched the top of Vivian's head, startling the girl and leaving her utterly astonished by the gesture. Vivian innocently asked if the young lady was trying to copy her way of dressing and acting. All at once, Vivian sensed something was oddly off about her own face, judging by the meaningful look in Rachel's eyes. The little girl was mortified to discover a leaf still stuck in her hair, realizing the knights must have been teasing her about it this whole time without her noticing. Vivian pouted, scolding Rachel for not telling her sooner and letting her be embarrassed the entire way back. Rachel smirked with satisfaction and told her to be grateful, since at least she'd mentioned it before the two of them went in to see the Duke. Vivian froze in utter disbelief, unable to trust her own eyes at the sight of the notoriously icy young lady actually smiling. The little girl reassured herself that she must be seeing things, since someone like Rachel could never smile at her so naturally like that. Vivian suddenly remembered that right after returning to the mansion, a formal dinner with the Duke awaited the two of them. As the carriage rolled through the mansion's imposing gates in the dead of night, Vivian felt an odd flutter of nervousness. Dinner unfolded in a deeply silent atmosphere, with only the dry clink of knives and forks against porcelain plates breaking the quiet. Drawing on her memory of the original story, Vivian understood clearly that the relationship between Rachel and her grandfather had never been a good one. The little girl sensed an invisible distance and a cold detachment that had lingered between the two of them ever since the young lady was small. Vivian even felt closer to the gatekeeper than the two of them seemed to feel toward each other, despite being family. Unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere any longer, the little girl decided she had to find a way to break the frightening silence. Vivian began chattering away about how, from the top of the hill, one could see the whole beautiful, radiant village below. The Duke nodded, admitting the idea wasn't bad, and Vivian added that they shouldn't have made him wait too long for dinner, which was why they'd come back early. The little girl wondered to herself why the Duke didn't just ask directly whether his granddaughter had enjoyed herself or found anything fun in the village. Vivian even warmly invited him to join their next outing if he could ever find the time. The dreadful silence settled in once more, leaving Vivian feeling utterly suffocated and restless with every bite she took. The little girl told herself that for the sake of Rachel's future, mending ties with family was absolutely urgent, so the girl wouldn't lose her way. Vivian resolved to first uncover the real reason behind the distance that had grown between grandfather and granddaughter. Just then, a man burst into the dining room in a great rush, calling out loudly for the Duke. He hurriedly apologized for the intrusion and reported that an urgent matter had unexpectedly arisen. Meanwhile, back at Vivian's family bakery, a sudden knock rattled the shop door in the dead of the quiet night. Vivian's father wearily called out that the shop was closed, only to freeze at the sight of the uninvited guests before him. A man bearing the Royal Knight's emblem recognized Diaz-Hessan and asked if he was indeed the father of the little girl Vivian. Diaz-Hessan's face showed clear, deep anxiety. He silently prayed that his daughter's true identity had not yet been discovered by the royal family. The royal soldier stepped inside the shop with heavy footsteps, creating an intensely tense and oppressive atmosphere for the shop owner. Curtis Rohan repeated his question about Diaz-Hessan's identity, while the man stood silently, facing the harsh interrogation. Behind his back, Diaz-Hessan secretly gripped a sharp knife, seemingly prepared for the worst to protect his family. Curtis introduced himself as being from the Royal Knights and expressed his wish to speak with Vivian briefly about some important matters concerning the young lady. Diaz-Hessan suppressed his rising anger, wondering why the noble royal palace would go through the trouble of seeking out his young daughter. Curtis explained that he'd heard Vivian was the Edie family's study companion, and he simply wanted to ask for some information for his work. Diaz felt a quiet wave of relief knowing Vivian wasn't home at this sensitive moment, though his hand never once left his weapon. He politely apologized and informed the knights that his daughter was currently out, leaving them looking rather disappointed. At the worst possible moment, Vivian came bursting cheerfully into the house, announcing loudly that she was home, shattering every attempt her father had made to conceal her presence. Diaz Hessen could only bury his face in his hands and sigh in exasperation at his carefree daughter's impeccably terrible timing. Vivian stopped short, sensing the strange atmosphere in the shop caused by the presence of these large, rather intimidating men. The little girl stared warily at the strange visitors, sensing the considerable threat they posed to her family. It looked to her as though her father were being surrounded and pressured by the knights in an attempt to win their daughter's sympathy, which only made Vivian more worried for his safety. One knight stepped closer and asked if she was indeed Vivian, the friend of the Duke's young lady whom they were looking for. Noticing the man's forced smile, Vivian silently reminded herself to be extremely careful with people who smiled outwardly while scheming inwardly. The little girl bravely confirmed her identity and heard them introduce themselves as royal knights carrying out the emperor's direct orders. Vivian suddenly recalled something very important as she looked at the clothing and emblem worn by the men before her. Her eyes fixed on the royal crest finely embroidered onto the sleeve of the knight standing in front of her. She remembered the time her father had once shown her a picture of this very emblem and given her careful, detailed warnings about it. Her father had once told her that if she ever saw anyone bearing this symbol, she must stay far away since they were royal agents who could punish an innocent person at any moment. He had warned that the closer someone stood to the emperor, the more terrifying and merciless their punishment could be toward ordinary people. Back at the mansion, the sudden appearance of the palace inspector had left the Duke's expression extremely tense and grim. These people from the palace were really here to spy and dig for information, aiming to find a way to harm or control Rachel. Back at the bakery, the knight Curtis tried to invite Vivian outside to talk privately, but the little girl flinched and stepped back in fear. Diaz Hessen immediately placed a hand on the knight's shoulder to block his rough, overbearing attempt to approach his daughter. He declared he would speak right here and shielded Vivian firmly within his protective embrace. Diaz explained that anyone without children of their own could never understand a father's worry and protectiveness for his daughter. Curtis angrily insisted that a royal knight's word was equivalent to a supreme command, and defying it would be treated as a serious act of treason. Vivian grew deeply anxious seeing her father cornered, fearing he might be harmed if a confrontation broke out with the elite knights. Even knowing her father was no fighter at all, the little girl still resolved to stand up and protect him by any means she could. Vivian suddenly spoke up, asking what exactly these knights were hinting at with all their pressuring threats. Curtis Rohan repeated that he wanted to ask about Lady Rachel, exactly as Vivian had anticipated and mentally prepared for. Vivian thought to herself that although she was Rachel's friend, she would never sell out any information, especially since her opponent looked like a bachelor easy for her to wrap around her finger. The little girl smiled with hidden intent, deciding to use the crafty logic of a 9-year-old to wear these men down completely. A moment later, Vivian launched a relentless barrage of why questions that left the royal knights increasingly flustered and out of patience. They scratched their heads in confusion, unsure how to explain the tangled schemes of adults to a mere child. The flustered knight admitted that the relationship between the emperor and the young lady wasn't good, which was why they'd come to ask Vivian about it. Vivian acted utterly shocked to hear that the young lady was on bad terms with the emperor and began pressing him relentlessly about why. To cover his embarrassment, the royal knight hurriedly praised the emperor as a benevolent man who simply wanted to check on the young lady's well-being. Finding the explanation plausible enough, Vivian moved on to her next tactic, picking apart their words to keep the pressure on. The little girl demanded to know why the emperor didn't care about her and her father too, since they were also loyal subjects under his rule. The knight, breaking out in a cold sweat, insisted the emperor surely did care about them, then deliberately turned the question back, asking if Vivian was doing all right living here, hoping to change the subject. Vivian secretly gloated at how inexperienced this knight was and decided to start rambling on about completely unrelated personal matters. She boasted about becoming the leader of the village children and bravely exploring a terrifying abandoned house in the forest. Curtis, alarmed, asked whether Lady Rachel had joined her in that reckless test of courage. Upon learning Rachel hadn't gone along, the knights grew furious, demanding to know why Vivian was wasting their time telling them such nonsense. Vivian instantly pouted and put on a pitiful face at being scolded, making the two towering men suddenly feel like bullies picking on a child. The little girl sulked, pointing out that they were the ones who'd asked her first and were now getting angry, so she decided she wouldn't tell them anything else at all. History tells that the emperor who founded the Hindian Empire had once been a great archmage of unmatched magical power. Thanks to that bloodline, nearly all his descendants were blessed with an enormous reserve of mana, barring some unusual circumstance. Yet throughout history, there had occasionally been those born of royal blood who rebelled and sought to overturn the empire's established order. One of them was the previous crown prince, a man of extraordinary talent who was also Rachel's late father. As a powerful mage, he had been publicly executed for the unforgivable crime of coveting the throne and conspiring against the crown. From then on, the emperor had always kept a close watch on Rachel, fearing the child might inherit the royal power and repeat her father's bloody downfall. Back in the present, Curtis thought for a long while before telling Vivian to think very carefully before giving her final answer. The little girl's father looked displeased and reminded the knight he'd get nothing out of a 9-year-old child. Before leaving, Curtis suddenly stepped closer and studied Diaz Hessen carefully, feeling there was something oddly familiar about his face. Diaz Hessen kept his calm smile, insisting this was the first time the two of them had ever met, and acting as though he didn't know the knight at all. Curtis eventually concluded he must have been mistaken, while Vivian thought to herself that her father truly carried a presence that was far from ordinary. The royal knights finally left the bakery, to the relief and joy of both father and daughter. Diaz told Vivian to stay away from the Duke's house for the time being, since the steward had informed them the mansion was busy hosting important guests. Vivian worried that the palace's people showing up right after she'd become Rachel's friend might make the Duke suspicious of her. The little girl felt deeply troubled that she had barely made a good friend before running into trouble, and she racked her brain trying to find a way to clear the mansion master's suspicions. Suddenly, Vivian had a brilliant idea and cried out with joy, having remembered an important detail that could help her. When her father called her for dinner, Vivian rushed off at once to carry out the plan that had just sprouted in her mind, without stopping to explain anything. The little girl darted into the kitchen and began preparing what she needed with a look of fierce determination and excitement. Vivian felt certain that once she showed the Duke this, all his suspicions and the distance between her and Rachel's family would surely vanish completely. A week later at the mansion, Rachel sat by the window, thinking to herself that Vivian was probably no different from all the other shallow children she'd met before. She recalled how her past friends always used excuses like a new baby in the family or being busy, just to avoid coming to play with her anymore. At first, Rachel had still believed the apology letters citing health issues or visiting distant relatives, and had even diligently written back to them. But in truth, none of them dared to come, knowing she was the daughter of a traitor, and fearing the emperor's punishment might fall on their families too. Rachel bitterly realized that Sally and her mother's promises to always stay by her side were nothing more than meaningless flattery. From that fateful day on, the young lady of House Edie had decided she would never again place her trust or reliance on anyone. She sat lost in thought, recalling Vivian's bright smile and her sincere declaration of how much she liked her, from just the day before. Even though Vivian had said that, Rachel still told herself the girl would soon leave her behind, just like everyone else. Rachel felt deeply irritated and troubled, unable to understand why her feelings had grown so chaotic whenever she thought of Vivian. A sudden knock broke the silence, startling Rachel as she turned to look toward the door. For a brief moment, she hoped it might be Vivian returning, but in reality, it was someone else waiting there. Sally walked into the room looking cheerful and excited, asking if her noble young lady happened to be busy reading. Rachel kept her frosty demeanor, paying no mind at all to the presence of the girl who had been her playmate for so long. Sally eagerly invited Rachel to play with dolls or pretend house to pass the time, but received only unnerving silence from the young lady in return. The little maid felt deeply offended that Rachel wouldn't even spare her a glance, despite all her effort. Sally began to notice a drastic change in the young lady, who had always been reserved but never this coldly indifferent. Furious, she blamed it all on that country bumpkin Vivian for corrupting Rachel, feeling the girl's presence was simply a nuisance. Sally spitefully remarked that the young lady must be relieved that Vivian was no longer around bothering her quiet reading time. She insisted Vivian was only pretending to be kind and had already shown her true colors by fleeing in fear after just a few short days. Sally promised to always stay by her side forever, only to be immediately and mercilessly ordered out of the room by Rachel. Sally froze in shock, unable to believe her own ears at the young lady's cruel, decisive command to throw her out. Rachel snapped that Sally was far too noisy and demanded she leave the room at once, her eyes burning with anger. Sally trudged through the mansion's vast garden, seething with resentment and fury at having been cast out. Standing among the flower bushes, Sally trembled with rage, quietly plotting some way to get revenge after being treated so badly. Sally angrily took her frustration out on the flower pots in the garden, her mood utterly foul. She spitefully blamed all her troubles on that hateful little girl. Sally cursed Vivian as a country bumpkin who had the nerve to seduce the person who was destined to become her future husband. A memory surfaced of her mother telling her that Lady Rachel, due to her circumstances, currently had to live as a girl, but would later grow up to become a man and marry her. At the time, Sally had naively asked more about this grand matter, and her mother had assured her it was certain, telling her to be sure to play well with the young lady. Back in the present, Sally shouted with fierce determination that no matter what happened, Rachel would definitely marry her one day. Suddenly, a man appeared right behind her and casually called Sally a little brat. He gave a mocking smile and shot back a question, asking how a true young lady could ever become her husband. The Duke was surprised that the uninvited guests from the palace had withdrawn so quickly when he had expected them to stay a whole month to snoop around. The assistant standing beside him remarked that checking on the local tutors was just a pretext, their real purpose being to keep watch over the mansion. The Duke slammed his hand down on a stack of documents, his face full of tension, sensing that something ominous was about to unfold. In his memory, before Isla passed away, she had desperately begged her father to protect her poor grandson, revealing the truth about Rachel's true gender. The Duke sat brooding at his desk, a lonely figure beneath the dim candlelight, weighed down by worries he couldn't put into words. He ordered his subordinates to immediately reinforce the mansion's security to prepare for the turmoil ahead. The assistant reported that he had gathered complete information on Vivian and her father, Diaz Hessen, exactly as the Duke had requested. The Duke found it a deeply suspicious coincidence that Vivian and her father had shown up at the mansion right as the palace inspector was paying a visit. According to the report, Diaz Hessen was 29 years old, ran a bakery in the village, and had very good relations with the local townspeople. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, and no one knew anything about the man's past before he'd settled here with his daughter. The Duke pressed further, asking if Vivian's father had any connection to the Emperor's people, given that the knights had visited the bakery on the very same day as the inspection. Based on what he'd overheard, the assistant guessed that the group of knights had left empty-handed, and there had been no further contact since. The assistant set a small pink notebook on the desk and told the Duke there was something concerning Vivian that needed to be reported right away. It was a report written by Vivian's own hand and sent to the Duke, in which the little girl had observed and analyzed the royal knights in remarkable detail. Recalling the earlier encounter in the hallway, the assistant had asked Vivian why she wanted to send this to the Duke. Vivian had flashed a bright smile and clearly declared that it was because she always stood on the Duke's side. The assistant smiled, recalling the child's confident expression as she firmly affirmed her loyalty. The Duke began flipping through the notebook with curiosity and surprise at the commoner girl's unexpected gesture. In her journal entry, Vivian recounted that after dinner, she'd come home to find 3 royal knights waiting for her, describing their appearances with a naive but remarkably accurate eye. The little girl noted down that they had asked about the young lady's condition, and were curious whether she knew how to use magic. Reading this, the Duke couldn't help bursting into delighted laughter at Vivian's cleverness. He realized that from their very first meeting, this little girl had already proven herself to be an exceptionally sharp child, adept at handling any situation. With a pleased expression, the Duke felt he had just recruited an incredibly useful talent, and he ordered someone to summon Vivian at once. The next day, the Edie mansion gleamed brilliantly under the bright sunlight, ready for a new meeting. Vivian happily skipped across the lawn toward the mansion, brimming with excitement. She wondered quietly how Rachel had been doing lately, knowing the young lady probably wasn't expecting her, but she herself was eager to see her friend. The moment she arrived, Vivian stopped short, spotting Rachel's familiar figure walking ahead of her. The little girl cheered excitedly and waved to the young lady, but Rachel seemed not to notice at all and kept walking. Vivian hurried after her, wondering if perhaps she just hadn't called out loud enough for her friend to hear. The little girl ran while calling out her friend's name, her face full of worry as she watched Rachel keep walking on without ever turning back. Rachel suddenly spun around with a sharp, icy look that startled Vivian. The young lady asked bitterly what Vivian had come back here for, wondering if she too had come to say a farewell like all the others. Rachel insisted she didn't need any such farewells, and told Vivian to go home, adding that the girl was probably scared too of being tied to the child of a traitor. Vivian stood frozen, catching her breath, pained to realize the young lady had misunderstood, thinking she was going to abandon her too just because she hadn't visited for a few days. The little girl saw the deep sorrow hidden in Rachel's eyes and understood that, fearing further hurt, the young lady had shut her own heart away. In the novel, Rachel was branded the Villainess, but Vivian knew that deep down she was simply a poor child who had always lived in fear of being abandoned. Vivian resolved to tell Rachel that she wasn't afraid at all and had absolutely no intention of ever leaving the young lady's side. Seeing Rachel about to walk away, Vivian hurriedly reached out to hold her back so she could explain her true feelings. The sound of Rachel's footsteps faded into the frightening silence, leaving Vivian able only to cry out in anguished regret. The little girl clenched her sleeve tight, vowing to herself that no matter how hard the young lady tried to push her away, she would keep holding on and drawing closer still. Vivian chased after her and clearly declared she would stay by her side until the young lady finally learned to trust her. Rachel gave no reply, only swinging her wooden sword in silence, the dry clashing sounds slicing through the air. The young lady threw herself into a frenzy of training against the wooden dummy, while Vivian sat nearby, watching every move with worry. Beads of sweat trailed down the young lady of House Edie's face, set in an expression of fierce resolve tinged with melancholy. Vivian could sense her friend was pushing herself too hard and feared that this kind of self-punishment would only get Rachel hurt. The young lady swung her sword with such force that it carved sharp arcs through the air. Suddenly, an accident occurred, injuring Rachel, who clutched her arm, her face twisted in pain. Vivian jumped up in alarm and cried out for the young lady in utter panic. The little girl rushed over to check the bleeding wound on Rachel's arm, asking after her with a voice full of worry. Rachel roughly shoved her friend's hand away and snapped at Vivian to just go away and stop worrying about her. Rachel's face showed clear panic and anguish at having her vulnerability exposed in front of someone else. Afterward, the young lady ran off, ignoring Vivian's calls after her. Vivian looked her friend straight in the eye and firmly declared once more that she would never leave. At that very moment, the wretched mana illness suddenly flared up again, causing Vivian such tight chest pain she could hardly breathe. The little girl collapsed, painfully realizing she needed to reach Rachel quickly to stabilize her mana. Racked with agonizing pain, Vivian trembled, wondering why on earth this had to happen at such an unfortunate moment. Vivian thought to herself that just one touch of Rachel's hand would make the pain vanish instantly. But the little girl hesitated, not wanting to use Rachel as a mere cure, now that she knew about the wounds in her friend's heart. Vivian tried to endure the pain in order to find a way to clear up Rachel's misunderstanding, unwilling to let the young lady suffer any further hurt. The little girl staggered forward in vain, her mind consumed by only one thought, to protect her little friend's feelings. Finally, her strength completely spent, Vivian collapsed into darkness, Rachel's desperate cries ringing in her ears. Rachel rushed over in a panic toward Vivian, who lay unconscious on the ground. The young lady carried her friend and ran as fast as she could, repeatedly pleading for Vivian to wake up, begging her not to leave her alone. Deep in her heart, Rachel felt overwhelmed with regret, wishing she hadn't deliberately pushed the little girl away before it was too late. The young lady stood frozen, staring at Vivian's motionless body, her heart clenching with the fear of losing her only friend. Rachel softly called out Vivian's name in utter shock and boundless fear. The crash of shattering dishes echoed out, signaling an ominous omen. The memory of the day her own mother died came flooding back, as Rachel had once witnessed a similar scene and screamed for her mother. The image of her mother lying motionless on the floor once again crushed Rachel's heart with the haunting fear of death and abandonment. Rachel collapsed beside Vivian, feeling as though her entire world were collapsing all over again. The young lady gathered every ounce of strength to run and find help, her cries for aid piercing the air. Rachel sat in a daze beside the sickbed, repeatedly begging Vivian to wake up soon. The little girl said painfully that she would accept even a goodbye, that Vivian could even leave if she had to, as long as she survived. The door burst open and a man rushed in, medical bag in hand. Brian anxiously asked about the situation, saying he had rushed over the moment he heard the young lady had collapsed. Rachel called out Brian's name through tears, seemingly unable to speak from sheer emotion. The little girl sobbed as she desperately begged the doctor to save this child's life. Brian was taken aback by the young lady's intense reaction, since this was something he had never witnessed from her before. He recalled that even at her own mother's funeral, Rachel had never shed a single tear, always keeping a cold, unmoved expression. The doctor privately felt relieved that the young lady had finally learned to express her emotions after so long suppressing them. Still, he worried that a situation reopening such traumatic memories wouldn't be good for Rachel's development. Brian approached the bed and reassured them that, judging by her color, it didn't seem too serious, and asked permission to examine her more closely. He gently took Vivian's hand to begin the examination under Rachel's anxious watch. Just then, Margaret walked in to announce it was time for the young lady's etiquette class. She was utterly startled at the chaotic scene in the room and gasped in shock. Brian explained that Vivian had suddenly fainted, and although there were no visible external wounds, he needed to examine her more thoroughly to find the real cause. The nanny Margaret gave a small, calculating smile, seeing the situation shifting exactly as she'd intended. Margaret approached and remarked that Lady Rachel looked quite shaken, advising her to go rest immediately. In response, Rachel coldly refused, insisting she would stay right there until the examination was over. Margaret had no choice but to give in. She said if that made the young lady feel better, so be it, and announced she'd postpone the etiquette lesson to the next day. The moment she stepped out of the room, Margaret's face turned bitter, blaming that girl Vivian for being the reason the young lady dared to defy her. She peeked through the door crack, thinking to herself that this was truly a golden opportunity to drive the troublesome child out of the mansion for good. Meanwhile, Vivian still lay unconscious on the bed, completely unaware that she had become the target of the nanny's scheme. It had all begun 5 years earlier, on that fateful day when Lady Isla passed away. That was also when Margaret began her process of manipulating and controlling the life of the poor child Rachel. She constantly whispered in Rachel's ear that if she ever stepped outside the mansion, the Emperor and everyone around her would look at her with hostile eyes. Margaret even used the secret of Rachel's true gender as leverage, threatening that if it were ever exposed, not just Rachel but the entire family would be thrown into grave danger. She feigned kindness, promising to always stay by Rachel's side until death in order to make herself the boy's sole source of support. The true purpose behind Margaret's elaborate manipulation of this defenseless child was ultimately a single scheme. Though Rachel currently had to force herself to pose as a girl, Margaret understood well that women's clothing couldn't hide the truth forever as the boy grew older. The Duke, well aware of this too, had quietly had Rachel train in magic in secret, so he would be able to protect himself in the future. His plan was that once Rachel grew strong enough, he would stop posing as a girl and officially appear as the true heir of House Edie. Margaret, however, had far grander schemes. She wanted Rachel to eventually marry her own daughter Sally, so she could rightfully seize power for herself. But Vivian's arrival had ruined everything, as the girl dared to win over even the proud Duke Comte himself. Vivian had even boldly brought Rachel out into the vast world beyond, something Margaret had worked so hard to prevent all this time. She decided she would exploit the fact that Vivian was protecting Rachel, simply fabricating an illness to frighten everyone and drive the girl out, just as she had done with Rachel's previous friends. Margaret went to the study and knocked, asking to see the Duke to report the situation. The Duke looked up and asked to confirm for certain that the child studying alongside his granddaughter had suddenly fainted. Margaret sighed softly, saying Dr. Brian was examining her and that Rachel absolutely refused to leave Vivian's bedside even for a moment. She feigned hesitation, expressing that while she didn't wish for anything bad to happen, there was something that deeply concerned her. She hinted that if Vivian turned out to have some incurable illness, Rachel would surely suffer an extremely severe psychological shock. The Duke pondered this thoughtfully and admitted that Margaret's suggestion to separate the two children did have some merit. He understood that Rachel had already been forced to confront the concept of death at far too young an age. If, heaven forbid, Vivian were to die, he genuinely feared his granddaughter would completely fall apart. In the quiet room, the Duke kept a pensive expression, surrounded by his trusted aides. Margaret stood behind him, unable to hide a triumphant smirk as she saw her scheme to drive the two apart moving exactly according to plan. Vivian lay deep in sleep beneath the dim light of the sick room. The little girl let out a soft moan, showing the first signs of waking from her long unconsciousness. Vivian stared blankly up at the ceiling, her mind still spinning, unsure of what was happening to her. She wondered why she was lying here, noticing that this ceiling looked terribly unfamiliar. Suddenly, the memory of that violent, chest-splitting pain came rushing back, making the little girl tremble with fear. Vivian recalled the last moment before everything went dark and she collapsed. The little girl sat up in a panic, worried about how Rachel might have reacted while she was unconscious. As she turned, Vivian froze at the sight of Rachel sitting right beside the bed, keeping watch, her face pale. The little girl silently wondered if Rachel had really stayed by her side this whole time. Rachel started and quickly asked whether Vivian was truly all right now, leaving the girl unsure how to respond. Vivian awkwardly apologized for scaring the young lady, insisting this wasn't anything too serious. But the little girl immediately panicked upon realizing she had just accidentally confessed to hiding her illness for years. The little girl fell into despair, thinking she would surely be thrown out this time for having deceived everyone. She watched Rachel's reaction anxiously, thinking the young lady must be furious over this secret. Rachel coldly asked whether Vivian always fainted like this every time her illness flared up. Vivian hastily explained this was the first time she had ever fainted, and that normally the pain only lasted about 20 minutes before fading on its own. Rachel kept pressing, demanding to know why Vivian had endured such pain alone without ever speaking up sooner. Vivian could only stare back with wide, innocent eyes, unsure how to defend her own actions. Hearing Rachel admit she truly believed Vivian was going to die because of her, the pink-haired girl suddenly felt her nose sting with emotion. Vivian realized that behind Rachel's icy exterior lay a pure heart that always worried deeply for her friends. The little girl told herself Rachel was no longer just a character from a book, but had become her real friend, which meant she needed to be honest. Vivian gently took Rachel's hand and said she had something very important she wanted to share. She tightened her grip on her friend's trembling hands as if trying to pass on some of her own strength. Vivian bravely declared she wasn't afraid of the young lady at all, even knowing everyone called her the child of a traitor. She felt it was deeply unfair for the young lady to suffer people's scorn when she had done nothing wrong. Vivian insisted firmly that when a friend is in trouble, one shouldn't run away, but instead trust and help one another. Once again, Vivian promised she would always stand by Rachel's side no matter what happened. Rachel froze at her friend's sincere declaration, as though the ice around her heart was slowly beginning to melt. Just then, a knock at the door cut through the touching moment between the two children. The door opened, and the steward entered along with Margaret, both wearing extremely stern expressions. Vivian anxiously shrank back on the bed, fearing they had come to interrogate her about hiding her illness. The steward asked after Vivian's health, and the little girl politely thanked the young lady for having called the doctor so quickly. Catching sight of Margaret's meaningfully knowing smile behind him, Vivian had an ominous feeling something bad was about to happen. The steward gently advised Vivian that, for safety's sake, she should go home and rest, out of concern her illness might worsen. He even promised full support to help her recover soon and return to the mansion as quickly as possible. Vivian's whole body went weak as she realized they were deliberately using this show of concern as a pretext to separate her from Rachel. She looked over at Margaret and instantly understood why the woman looked so confident and triumphant. Yet Vivian suddenly hatched a bold idea upon realizing that her own illness might actually serve as a kind of remedy for the young lady. The biggest problem now was how a child like her could possibly convince the nobility to believe something so unfounded. She understood that diagnosing mana-related illnesses was an incredibly complex matter requiring genuine magical experts. Slim as the chance was, Vivian resolved to give it one last try to protect her place beside Rachel. Just then, Dr. Brian burst into the room in a rush, an ancient magical medical book in hand. He apologized profusely for the intrusion, but explained he had gotten too excited after finally discovering the cause of Vivian's illness. The doctor confidently declared that the illness the girl carried was not contagious to others at all. He flipped open the book and clearly announced that Vivian suffered from mana overload, a rare condition, but one whose symptoms matched perfectly. Vivian was overjoyed beyond words, feeling as though she'd just won the lottery, having received this precious confirmation from an actual expert. Margaret, standing nearby, seethed and trembled with fury at seeing fortune once again side with this commoner child. Dr. Brian confidently assured everyone he could fully treat Vivian's condition. The Duke confirmed the results of the examination and felt an immense wave of relief at this crucial piece of information. He instructed Steward Owen to simply tell Vivian there was a way to ease her symptoms, while keeping absolutely secret Rachel's unique physical condition. He thought to himself that Vivian becoming his granddaughter's study companion truly seemed like an incredibly fortunate arrangement for them both. In this small village where they had come to hide the young lady's power, fate had brought these two children together. It was a rare coincidence indeed that a child with a rare illness that strengthened Rachel's power had also become her playmate. The Duke tapped lightly on his desk, telling himself that life sometimes held such wondrous coincidences, almost like magic. Steward Owen remarked that Lady Rachel truly seemed to cherish and enjoy being around Vivian. The Duke admitted that he had initially only brought Vivian in as a cover to conceal Rachel's gender, but the outcome had far exceeded his expectations. He smiled with satisfaction, feeling incredibly fortunate that everything was unfolding in such a positive direction. He stepped closer to the window and let out a puzzled murmur upon spotting someone in the distance. Down in the mansion's courtyard, Vivian's father, Diaz Hessen, had come to pick up his daughter after her fainting spell. The Duke stared intently at Diaz's face, feeling a strangely familiar sensation stirring within him. He racked his memory, feeling as though he were on the verge of recalling someone tremendously important from the past. A hazy image surfaced in his mind, reminding him of a fierce warrior amid a blazing battlefield. He wondered if the man standing over there truly bore the same features as that person. Yet he immediately dismissed the thought, knowing full well that person had died long ago, though deep down he still wanted to verify it for certain. Finally, he ordered Owen to investigate the mysterious past of this man named Diaz Hessen thoroughly. Vivian, meanwhile, was absolutely elated. The little girl skipped along, seeing that everything had been resolved smoothly. What made her happiest of all was that she and Rachel had truly become close friends. Vivian silently vowed to herself that she would always protect Rachel and bring her happiness no matter the cost. Suddenly, the little girl stopped short, sensing a warm gaze watching her from behind. Vivian gasped upon realizing her father was standing there, watching her with an expression both stern and overflowing with love. The little girl asked in a panic where his glasses were, seeing him appear with an incredibly handsome face. Her father joked that he'd forgotten them in his rush and added, half worried, that his looks might end up charming other men too. Though he joked about it, Vivian noticed her father's eyes trembling, showing just how worried and scared he'd been when she fainted. The little girl remembered her mother had passed away from illness when she was still very young, making her the only family her father had left. Diaz lovingly stroked his daughter's head and reassured himself that he was fine, though inwardly he was still shaken by what had just happened. Vivian suddenly reached her arms forward, as if trying to embrace her father's boundless love. The little girl threw herself into her father's arms, both of them overcome with bashful emotion. Vivian whispered to her father not to worry too much, promising she would listen to the doctor and recover soon so she could live by his side for a long time. Father and daughter clasped hands tightly, both believing in a brighter, healthier future ahead. Vivian noticed her father's voice choking up with emotion, but the clever little girl pretended not to notice, sparing him any embarrassment. She thought to herself how awkward it felt to see a grown-up like her father on the verge of tears right in front of her. Since her poor father had only her in the world, Vivian resolved to turn everything around to secure a truly happy ending. A few days after that incident, the atmosphere at the Duke's mansion remained as dignified and quiet as ever. Vivian eagerly ran up to ask if Lady Rachel happened to be standing there waiting for her. Rachel coldly denied it, but deep down everyone understood the young lady had been longing for her closest friend for quite some time. Vivian laughed and teased at Rachel's expression, then wondered aloud why her friend was standing there. Rachel stayed silent for a moment before saying she'd come to tell Vivian to head straight into the mansion instead of going to the greenhouse. Vivian wondered why Rachel hadn't just sent a servant instead of coming herself, which made Rachel blush with embarrassment at being caught waiting for her friend. Vivian brushed the matter aside and eagerly asked what they'd play together today, but Rachel replied she hadn't thought of anything yet. While strolling along, Vivian got the idea to visit the enormous library she had spotted the last time. The little girl excitedly gripped Rachel's hand, expressing her burning desire to see that place with her own eyes. Rachel flinched slightly at Vivian's sudden gesture. Vivian snapped back to her senses, panicking at how she'd casually grabbed the young lady's hand without thinking. The little girl worried that the last time Rachel had held her hand was only when she'd fainted, and the young lady had been moved to pity. Vivian waited anxiously, fearing Rachel would shake her hand off, but she told herself she mustn't panic. Just then, a man appeared to announce Vivian's presence. Vivian responded cheerfully, seemingly relieved that everything still seemed fine. The man solemnly relayed that the Duke wished to see Vivian alone. This news left Vivian completely stunned, unable to understand why such a powerful man would want to meet with her. Vivian entered the room somewhat timidly, bracing herself for a tense confrontation with the head of the household. Facing the Duke directly for the first time, Vivian thought he seemed quite stern and reminded herself not to let any weakness show while he sipped his tea. The Duke set down his teacup and suddenly asked Vivian if she knew what the Emperor thought of Rachel. Vivian, taken aback, replied that Lady Rachel had told her about it just yesterday. However, the Duke wanted to know whether she had known about his relationship with the Emperor even before hearing it from Rachel. Vivian recalled the report she had once sent him about 3 knights inquiring about Rachel's magic after a certain dinner. The little girl worried over her reasons for sending that report, but still clearly remembered the knights asking about the young lady's situation. Sensing her opponent was sharp and perceptive, Vivian decided to be honest rather than try to cover things up with lies. Vivian admitted she had overheard the adults in the village gossiping, and the Duke went on to press her further about her own feelings toward the Emperor. The unexpected question left Vivian breaking out in a cold sweat, unsure how to answer properly. The little girl wrestled with herself over whether she should speak ill of the Emperor right there, knowing full well the Duke had no love for the man either. Still, her opponent remained the ruler of an entire nation, and Vivian wondered whether pure honesty was really what the Duke wanted to hear. In the end, Vivian bowed her head and admitted she truly didn't know, since she had never once met the Emperor herself. She explained she had been taught not to judge others based on rumor, but there was one thing she was absolutely certain of. With a determined look in her eyes, Vivian declared that making children bear the sins of their parents was simply wrong. That was precisely why she wanted to stay by Rachel's side to protect and support her. The Duke laughed and asked if she was pitying his granddaughter, which worried Vivian, thinking it would be far too arrogant for a mere commoner like her to pity a young lady. To her surprise, the Duke instead expressed his approval, saying he liked people who held their own convictions rather than mindless flatterers. He stressed that what he needed was a genuine, thinking person, not a blindly loyal subordinate. The person he needed was someone who would dare to stop him when he chose the wrong path. Someone with an unshakable belief in what was right. With that recognition, the Duke looked at Vivian with newfound trust and declared he would officially become her patron. Vivian's jaw dropped in astonishment, unable to believe her own ears at this momentous decision. The little girl hurriedly affirmed that she liked the idea very much and deeply treasured this opportunity. Vivian promised to work extremely hard, and the Duke couldn't help but smile with satisfaction at her enthusiasm. Leaving the room, Vivian stood frozen before the great door, still not quite over the shock. Right after, the little girl leapt for joy, dashing all around the hallway in sheer happiness. The feeling of being recognized for her worth made Vivian feel more wonderful than ever before. Rachel suddenly appeared and asked what Vivian was doing to be so worked up. Vivian rushed over and threw her arms around Rachel in an overflowing burst of joy. She immediately bragged about being taken under the Duke's patronage, and how from now on the two of them could study together every day. Vivian noticed Rachel's face was flushed redder than usual and found it odd. Worried, the little girl placed her hand on Rachel's cheek and asked if her friend was okay. Rachel was so embarrassed she couldn't utter a word at this sudden, overly affectionate concern. Rachel flustered, pushed Vivian back slightly, while Vivian felt guilty, thinking she'd acted too familiarly. Vivian apologized, explaining she'd simply gotten carried away out of excitement, and Rachel agreed it truly was good news. Vivian asked if Rachel was happy for her, but Rachel just stayed silent, her cheeks still tinged pink. Rachel asked what Vivian's original purpose had been in coming here, which reminded the little girl of her plan to visit the library. Rachel repeated that Vivian wanted to see the library, and then reached out her own hand first, offering to lead the way. Vivian was deeply surprised and moved to see Rachel take the initiative to reach out first. Seeing Vivian standing there dazed, Rachel began to pull her hand back, thinking her friend didn't want it. Vivian immediately grabbed Rachel's hand tight and affirmed she wanted very much to go. The little girl smiled brightly, repeatedly expressing how much she loved the idea. Though the handhold felt a little awkward, Vivian had decided she wouldn't let go for a long while. A man knelt before the Emperor, revealing the secret that the child was actually a boy, not a girl. The Emperor burst into a fit of manic laughter, a cruel, triumphant cackle. His attendant broke into a cold sweat, trembling at his master's abrupt, unsettling shift in mood. The Emperor noted how strikingly the child resembled his father, sending a wave of fury coursing through him. Before becoming crown prince, he had once tried to poison his own younger brother, Leo Bright, purely out of jealousy. Though he regretted it the moment he saw his brother drink the poisoned cup. Luckily, Leo Bright had survived. Leo Bright had then relinquished the throne to his older brother, believing himself unworthy, which only fueled the man's resentment further. He grew furious at his brother's kindness and regretted not having killed Leo Bright then and there. Unwilling to live forever in his brother's shadow, he became determined to eliminate Leo Bright at any cost. He had finally claimed the throne he'd seized, yet his unease never left him. A knight rushed in breathlessly to report that Lady Isla, who had gone missing, had returned along with a child. The emperor was stunned to learn that Isla, the woman who had fled after Leo Bright's death, had now reappeared with a child of her own. Impatient that the knight didn't yet know who the child's father was, he decided to go verify it himself. Weighed down by unease, the emperor made his way to the Eady family mansion that very day. With just a single glance, he immediately recognized the unmistakable trace of Leo Bright's bloodline in the child. That child was Rachel, the offspring of the younger brother he had framed for treason and had put to death. Though he tried to reassure himself that Rachel, being merely a girl, posed no threat to his throne, he still couldn't shake off his torment. The ghost of Leo Bright appeared before him, demanding to know why he'd been killed even after giving up the throne. The emperor screamed in terror, thrashing to drive away his brother's ghost in a fit of delirium. The ghost's appearance left him living forever in the most profound fear, even knowing the child was supposedly a girl. He gritted his teeth upon realizing his enemy had left behind an heir in this world. With a look of pure malice, the emperor decided he had no choice but to kill this child to eliminate the threat once and for all. As class ended, the teacher reminded the two girls that reviewing past lessons mattered even more than learning new material. Vivian cheerfully greeted her teacher, while Rachel kept her usual composed demeanor. Once the teacher left, the two girls packed up their books to prepare for their next activity. Rachel took the initiative and invited Vivian along, her eyes noticeably gentler than before. Vivian smiled brightly, bursting with energy beside her close friend. The two of them walked hand in hand, looking every bit like true kindred spirits. Rachel remarked on how enthusiastically Vivian had greeted the teacher, then teased whether she'd found the lesson boring, but just pretended to pay attention. Vivian hastily denied it, swearing the lesson had been fascinating, even though Rachel had clearly seen through her lie. Rachel smiled and asked how she'd explain away the doodles scribbled all over her notebook earlier. Then, Vivian panicked upon realizing her friend had caught her random scribbles. The little girl made excuses, claiming she'd merely been practicing her art skills, since the teacher had said reviewing was the most important thing. Rachel kept teasing her about dozing off in class with her eyes rolled back, leaving the girl utterly speechless. Vivian gasped in alarm upon realizing she really had fallen asleep during the lesson earlier, and worried whether Rachel had been watching her the whole time. Vivian pleaded timidly with Rachel not to tell the Duke about her dozing off. Rachel kept a calm expression, replying that it would all depend on how Vivian behaved from now on, which made Vivian privately think the young lady was being far too demanding. Suddenly, Rachel let slip a quiet, secretive smile, which left Vivian dazed since she so rarely saw her friend like this. Vivian watched quietly, thinking Rachel had always been beautiful, but when she smiled, she became even more radiant. Vivian wondered why Rachel so rarely smiled all this time, feeling it was such a waste. Noticing Rachel's expression suddenly shift and turn cold, Vivian couldn't help but wonder what lay behind it. The Duke and Owen came down the stairs, and Vivian wondered aloud if he might be about to leave on a trip. Vivian and Rachel quickly bowed as the Duke approached, and he asked how the two children's lessons had gone that day. Vivian eagerly recounted that the class had been wonderful, since she'd gotten to study philosophy, art, and history all at once. Right after, Vivian suddenly remembered something and worried that Rachel might tattle on her for dozing off during class. However, glancing over, Vivian noticed Rachel didn't seem to have any intention of mentioning it to the Duke at all. Vivian stood quietly, observing the exchange between Rachel and the Duke, wondering whether this distance between them was really his fault. The Duke told the two children to go enjoy themselves and left with Owen, and Vivian politely wished him a safe journey. Watching the two men's backs recede, Vivian noticed the Duke didn't look happy at all, and silently hoped this family could find more harmony with one another. Vivian got the idea to invite the young lady for a light snack, reassuring herself she wasn't doing it just because she herself wanted to eat too. The peaceful garden scene unfolded, where the two children were about to enjoy an afternoon tea together. Vivian savored a delicious piece of cake with a look of pure, contented bliss. Remembering her true purpose, Vivian reminded herself not to forget her important task while sitting with Rachel. Vivian gently asked Rachel whether she was facing any difficulties or troubling thoughts weighing on her heart. Vivian went on to explain that ordinary friends should share their worries, comfort each other, and always stand by one another's side through hard times. Vivian said that sharing secrets one couldn't tell anyone else was exactly what made two people become close friends. Rachel lowered her gaze to the tea table. She stayed silent for a long moment before admitting she, too, had her own worries. Vivian told her about how her father had cut off contact with his family after marrying her mother, since they had fiercely opposed the marriage. She said sadly that whenever she asked about her grandparents, her father would just smile and change the subject, even though she wished so much for them to reconcile. Vivian believed that her late mother, now in heaven, would also wish for her father to be happy surrounded by family. Watching the young lady fall silent in thought, Vivian shared this story hoping Rachel might connect it to her own current relationship with the Duke. Rachel wondered aloud whether Vivian's father might be afraid his family would reject him all over again. Rachel said thoughtfully that there was no guarantee a family would forgive unconditionally, and that if the relationship broke down again, Vivian's father would truly be devastated. Vivian asked Rachel directly whether she had any worries or concerns about the Duke, but Rachel immediately denied it. Feeling relieved, Vivian wrapped up the conversation and told Rachel that from now on, whenever she had any worries, she should feel free to share them with her. Rachel asked again, sounding skeptical, but Vivian affirmed it with certainty since they were friends after all. Vivian said cheerfully that being friends meant sharing both joy and sorrow together. Rachel froze, staring silently at Vivian, her eyes wavering before her friend's warmth and sincerity. Vivian gently told Rachel she didn't need to force herself, but she also shouldn't bury her painful feelings for too long. A woman, the young lady's nanny, came to announce it was time for Rachel's next lesson to begin. Vivian wondered whether Rachel's private lesson might be related to her succession training. Vivian said goodbye to Rachel and arranged to meet again tomorrow, privately thinking this lesson was probably the magic training from the original story. As Vivian walked away, she felt oddly puzzled to notice the nanny wasn't following to attend to the young lady, but instead had stayed behind. The nanny offered to personally escort Vivian to the gate. Vivian was momentarily taken aback but politely accepted. Seeing the nanny smile, Vivian suddenly felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. The two of them walked together along the path leading to the mansion's gate, wrapped in silence. Vivian realized this path circled around the edge of the mansion and wondered why the woman was leading her this way. The nanny suddenly called Vivian's name in a stern voice and asked if she knew what the crime of treason meant. The air around them turned cold and tense as the woman stopped and looked at Vivian with an unsettling gaze. Vivian replied that she'd been taught it meant insulting or threatening the emperor and the royal family, though she couldn't understand why the woman was asking her this. The nanny continued pressing, asking if Vivian knew what fate awaited those found guilty of treason. She said coldly that the emperor's punishment for such people was utterly merciless. More specifically, the entire family of a traitor would be wiped out to the third generation as a warning to others. The parents of a traitor would be hanged to death. The traitor themselves would be sent to the guillotine to be executed publicly before a crowd. The children of a traitor would be taken far away and sold into slavery in foreign lands. The nanny emphasized that even those who helped a traitor would suffer the very same horrific punishment. Vivian felt these words were far too heavy for a 9-year-old child to bear. She asked, trembling, why the woman was telling her all this. The nanny then revealed the truth, that Rachel's father was the very person who had committed treason against the emperor. She warned that if Vivian kept staying by Rachel's side, not only she herself, but even her father would be in mortal danger. Vivian fell silent at this shocking truth. She realized this was the real reason Rachel always insisted on pushing everyone away. Vivian silently understood that Rachel wasn't cold at all. She was simply trying to protect the people around her from her family's misfortune. Vivian suddenly felt small and alone, lost in thought about everything Rachel had endured by herself for so long. Vivian felt outraged, realizing this woman had used such terrifying words to drive away all of Rachel's friends. Vivian composed herself. She pressed the nanny, asking why she herself still stayed by the young lady's side, knowing full well the danger lurking there. The nanny was briefly startled by Vivian's question. She replied that she had already staked her own life to serve the young lady. The woman said she believed Rachel was worth that risk. She looked at Vivian and said the girl was still too young to understand, and that with her current mindset, she would surely come to regret her choice one day. Vivian lowered her head in silence, but deep inside she was forming a decision entirely different from what the woman expected. Vivian suddenly lifted her head, her eyes turning sharp and more resolute than ever. Vivian looked straight at the nanny with none of the fear the woman had expected. She clearly declared that she, too, had staked her own life on this matter. Vivian affirmed she would never give up and was already prepared to face any danger to protect this friendship. Vivian turned and walked away, telling herself she absolutely had to separate Rachel from this scheming woman. She didn't know whether the nanny was truly protecting Rachel or had some other dark purpose in isolating the young lady from the outside world. She told herself that no matter the reason, hurting Rachel was completely wrong and unacceptable. Vivian resolved that the first thing she needed to do was find a way to help Rachel open her heart to the people around her. The next day, in a bustling town, Vivian took Rachel out for a stroll through the streets, both dressed in modest, unassuming clothes. Rachel asked why Vivian had brought her here. Vivian explained she wanted to buy gifts for the maids at the general store. She added that if the young lady gave the gifts herself, she might grow closer to the people working at the mansion. Rachel remained skeptical about why she needed to get friendly with those maids at all. Vivian playfully suggested that if they became close, Rachel could ask them to sneak snacks into her room late at night. Rachel turned away, saying flatly that she didn't need that, and that even if she did, they would always be afraid of her regardless. Vivian fell silent for a moment, sensing the deep insecurity within Rachel, which only made her more determined to help her friend. Vivian thought that if Rachel wanted to rely less on her nanny, she needed to build connections with other people in the household. Vivian reassured Rachel that they were only scared because they didn't understand her yet, not because they hated her. Vivian smiled brightly and said that anything unknown tends to inspire fear, whether it's an unfamiliar road or a new problem. Vivian affirmed that once people truly understood who Rachel was, that fear would surely disappear. Vivian took the initiative, grabbing Rachel's hand and pulling her into the general store. Inside the shop, Peter, the owner's son, lay dozing on the counter, snoring steadily. Vivian's greeting made Peter jolt awake with a start, and he began coughing from the surprise. Peter quickly sat up to greet the customer, but the moment he saw Vivian, he slipped right back into his usual teasing manner. Vivian threatened to tell his mother he'd been sneaking naps instead of properly minding the shop. Peter hastily denied dozing off, claiming he'd just been resting his eyes while pondering life's mysteries. Vivian scoffed, asking if anyone ever pondered life loudly enough to snore like that, leaving Peter speechless. Peter was about to ask what Vivian wanted to buy when he suddenly noticed her companion and froze for a few seconds. Peter leaned in and whispered, asking Vivian if the person standing there was the noble young lady she always talked about. Rachel kept her cold expression, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease at the stranger's curiosity. Peter fumbled to greet her, but Rachel abruptly turned and walked off elsewhere, leaving him dumbfounded. Vivian noticed Rachel seemed uncomfortable being in this place. Rachel asked in a low voice whether Peter was also a friend of Vivian's. Vivian moved closer to Rachel and introduced Peter as the son of Lauren, the shop's owner. Noticing Rachel didn't look very pleased, Vivian wondered whether the young lady simply disliked Peter. Vivian firmly affirmed that Peter was indeed a close friend of hers, which made Rachel suddenly go quiet. Rachel lowered her head, a gloomy, awkward air surrounding her, leaving Vivian unsure what she'd said wrong. Rachel mumbled something under her breath that made Vivian ask her to repeat it, since she hadn't caught it clearly. Finally, Rachel worked up the courage to ask Vivian to call her by her first name from now on, instead of using formal titles. Rachel wanted Vivian to address her just as casually as she did Peter. Vivian was quite taken aback. She wondered whether a mere commoner like herself could really get away with casually calling a noble young lady by name. Rachel blushed and insisted that as long as she herself gave permission, it was perfectly fine, and no problem at all. Vivian hesitantly tried out the name Rachel. It still felt a little unreal to her, and she worried whether she was doing it right. Watching her friend's bashful expression, Vivian suddenly realized Rachel genuinely wanted to do everything together, just like ordinary friends do. Vivian went on to ask if she could also speak more casually with Rachel without using formal language. Vivian felt thrilled, reasoning that as a commoner herself, there was no reason at all for her to turn down such a wonderful offer. The two children looked at each other, Rachel giving a small smile while Vivian responded with an enthusiastic yes. Vivian asked Rachel what gifts she planned to buy and whether she had any ideas in mind yet, telling her to just trust in her. The carriage began to roll, carrying the two children away from the shop. Vivian gradually drifted off to sleep, her head naturally resting against Rachel's shoulder. In her dream, Vivian stirred slightly and made small sounds. Rachel quietly watched her friend's expressions. Rachel looked at Vivian's sleeping face and thought to herself that the girl was probably dreaming of eating something delicious, even in her sleep. Rachel sat quietly, realizing this was the first time she'd ever felt this way. Rachel recalled the feeling of Vivian being the first person, aside from her mother and nanny, to voluntarily reach out and take her hand. More precisely, Vivian was the one who had taken Rachel's hand again after Rachel had deliberately pulled away, fearing her secret would be exposed. Vivian had promised to always stay by her side. In Rachel's memory, Vivian's honey-colored eyes had shone brilliantly in that moment. The little girl's hand had been so soft and warm that Rachel hadn't wanted to let go, not even for a second. To Rachel, Vivian was someone truly special, since she always stood by her side. Yet a fleeting doubt crossed her mind, wondering if she herself was really that special to Vivian. Rachel thought she was probably just one of many friends Vivian had. But deep down, she didn't want to be just an ordinary friend like anyone else. Rachel wanted Vivian to look only at her and to hold only her hand and no one else's. Rachel wanted to become someone special in Vivian's heart. She thought that if the two of them shared a secret together, perhaps their relationship would become something different. Rachel remembered Vivian once saying that friends should share true feelings and secrets they couldn't tell anyone else in order to grow closer. She truly agreed with that. "Let's take a short break and we'll be right back." Vivian curiously asked what exactly that was. Rachel replied she'd tell her before Vivian went home, leaving the girl unable to hide her curiosity. Rachel remained firm that now wasn't the right time, which only made Vivian more curious about what her friend was holding on to. Rachel told herself there were more important things to deal with right now, so that matter would have to wait, and Vivian agreed to talk about it later. Vivian silently reminded the young lady to remember what she'd said and urged her to hurry along. Rachel walked in looking somewhat tense and announced that she was home. The maids in the mansion were utterly surprised to see the young lady greet them on her own initiative. Vivian reminded Rachel that when the maids greeted her back, she should respond and mention that she had gifts for them, and the little girl silently praised her friend for doing so well. Rachel walked into the room, still visibly flustered at having to talk about giving gifts. Vivian asked the maids if they could spare a moment for her and Rachel, and they asked, surprised, what she needed. Vivian announced excitedly that Lady Rachel had prepared gifts for everyone. The maids couldn't hide their astonishment at the news. A collection of cosmetics was laid out on the table, giving off a gentle fragrance. The maids curiously asked what it was. Vivian explained it was a rose water beauty product that had become quite popular in the village lately. Vivian enthusiastically advertised that after washing your face clean and applying this water, your skin would become wonderfully soft. One maid recalled having once mentioned this very item and was surprised the young lady had remembered. Vivian added that while picking out the gifts, the young lady had said many heartfelt things. Speaking for Rachel, Vivian said she was very sorry she hadn't been able to prepare these gifts sooner for everyone. Rachel wondered to herself when exactly she had said any of that. Vivian continued, saying the young lady understood how hard everyone had worked, traveling all the way from the capital to get here. Rachel could only stay silent at her friend's little performance. The maids were deeply moved. They thanked the young lady and told her she needn't have gone through so much trouble. Seeing the surprise on Rachel's face, Vivian felt a touch of emotion. She realized Rachel had probably never imagined that such small gestures could change relationships this much. At that moment, the maids remarked that Vivian's hair looked a bit tangled and needed retying. Vivian blinked in confusion and asked them to repeat that. Vivian gasped and reached up to touch her head, realizing her hair had become completely disheveled. The little girl hurried off to find a mirror to check her appearance. Vivian stared at herself in shock, wondering when on earth this had happened. The little girl suddenly recalled that her tangled hair was the result of dozing off and leaning her head on Rachel's shoulder the whole ride in the carriage earlier. The maids told the young lady to just sit down and rest while they helped fix Vivian's hair. As one maid brushed Vivian's hair, she remarked that men usually found such small chores quite bothersome, but Vivian's father must love her dearly to take such care with it. Vivian proudly declared that her father loved her very much. The maid laughed and said he'd probably be devastated if his daughter ever brought a boyfriend home someday. The maid teasingly asked if Vivian was hiding any secret boyfriend or crush from her father. The little girl suddenly turned to look at the young lady, who seemed to be lost in some thought of her own. The two of them looked at their reflections together in the mirror, and the pink-haired girl noticed her friend's sulky, sullen expression. A question popped into her mind. Why did Rachel look like that? It seemed Vivian had suddenly caught on to something. She recalled a moment earlier when she'd asked Rachel if she liked a friend named Peter, and guessed that Rachel had been jealous of him. The little girl thought that perhaps for young girls, the idea of one's own identity was something quite important and sensitive. If that were true, she needed to do something about it. Vivian immediately declared she would never have a boyfriend or anything of the sort, since such things held no interest for her at all. Rachel glanced quietly at Vivian. Vivian privately thought there were probably plenty of boys who liked a sweet girl like her, but she declared she truly hated boys, since all they did was tease and cause mischief. The maid laughed and said there were plenty of good, well-behaved boys out there too. She asked further whether, without a boyfriend, Vivian planned never to marry at all. Vivian firmly stated she had no interest in marriage, and only wanted to live with her father and the young lady forever. She turned to ask Rachel if the two of them could stay friends for a very, very long time. Rachel fell silent, a pensive mood settling over her that left Vivian feeling a bit puzzled. The sky turned a brilliant orange as sunset spread across the mansion. Inside his study, the Duke was buried in paperwork. Looking at the calendar, he realized May had arrived, which meant Isla's death anniversary was drawing near. He remembered Isla in her younger days, bringing him flowers and reminiscing about their childhood memories together. 5 years had passed since Isla's passing, yet the Duke still couldn't get used to her absence. He thought that perhaps he would have to live with this lingering ache of longing for the rest of his life. Suddenly, he heard a distant call and wondered if it might be Vivian. He watched the two children playing and felt that the mansion had grown so much livelier ever since Vivian arrived, just like it had been in Isla's days. The Duke immediately dismissed such thoughts. He scolded himself for being so foolish, since no one could ever replace Isla. When the space grew quiet again, he wondered if Vivian had already gone home. There came a knock at the door. Vivian asked permission to come in and see the Duke for a moment, leaving him wondering why the little girl was looking for him. The Duke let her in. Vivian stepped inside, politely greeted him, and thanked him for taking the time to see her. He asked why she'd come here when she should have been studying with Rachel. Vivian explained that the young lady had gone off to her succession class long ago, and that she had a gift she wanted to give him. The Duke asked if that gift was truly meant for him. Vivian enthusiastically confirmed it and asked permission to come closer. He agreed. Vivian handed over the gift box and told him she'd bought it in the village earlier, but hadn't dared bring it to him sooner since he'd seemed busy. He opened the box and found a wooden bookmark inside. The Duke wondered aloud, since it wasn't his birthday, and he hadn't done anything special for her lately, why she would suddenly give him a gift. Vivian smiled and said there was no particular reason at all. She explained she'd been buying gifts for the maids at the general store and happened to spot this item, so she wanted to give it to him right away. He teased her, asking if she'd only bought it out of fear that an old man like him might sulk. Vivian hastily denied it. The little girl insisted she had thought very carefully to pick out a gift he would actually like. The Duke smiled gently. He remarked that it was ginkgo wood, a type insects despised, making it excellent for preserving books. He praised Vivian for having a good eye. The Duke said he would put it to good use. Vivian was overjoyed to hear this. Taking the opportunity, Vivian asked if she could come here from now on to read books together with him. To his surprise, she quoted her teacher, saying one could understand a person through the books they read. The Duke asked if that meant she wanted to understand what kind of person he was, and why. Vivian looked him straight in the eye and honestly said she wanted to become closer to him. He laughed, saying the gift had turned out to be a bribe after all, and asked what Vivian really wanted, promising to consider it if she told the truth. Vivian felt a flicker of nervousness and swallowed hard. The little girl gathered her courage to prepare to voice her true wish. The one thing Vivian truly wanted was to become the Duke's friend. The Duke was stunned into silence by her unexpected request. He asked skeptically why on earth she would want to be friends with him. Vivian smiled brightly, thinking to herself that she couldn't reveal her real reason, which was to observe the relationship between him and Rachel. So instead, she said it was because she felt he was a good person. She repeated her teacher's saying that gaining one good friend was like getting to live a whole other life. The Duke thought to himself that the lessons he'd had Vivian study only seemed to be making her more stubborn, but he couldn't help smiling at her determination. Vivian confidently insisted that being friends with her would be great fun, since she had plenty of friends around his age too. The Duke burst out laughing upon realizing he wasn't the only older person this little girl wanted to befriend. In the end, he nodded in agreement to her proposal. Vivian was overjoyed beyond words when the Duke told her she could come visit him any time. From that day on, Vivian began visiting the Duke's study more often, always timing it for whenever Rachel had to attend her succession lessons. The little girl worried she might get thrown out for being a nuisance, but she still politely thanked the Duke for the snacks he always had ready for her. Vivian savored the sweet pastries and thought to herself that since he always prepared food whenever she came, he must have taken a liking to her too. When the Duke asked what topic she wanted to discuss today, Vivian brought up a book she'd read during class, one that claimed life was a series of regrets. The Duke remarked that it was quite a profound book for a 9-year-old, and said he wanted to hear her thoughts on it. Vivian asked the Duke whether he had ever deeply regretted anything in his life, and shared that the book had brought back memories of things past. The little girl gazed off into the distance and began to tell a story from her own past, one tied to a lingering regret of her own. It was about a time when Vivian and her father had gone into the forest and stumbled upon a small but memorable event. She had found a baby bird that had lost its mother and decided to bring it home to care for it. Vivian had raised the little bird with great devotion until it grew strong enough, and then released it back into the vast forest. But sometime later, she was horrified to discover the bird had died right in front of her house, apparently bitten by a snake while trying to flee back to the place where it had once been loved. Vivian confessed she had deeply regretted releasing the bird, thinking that if she had kept it, it might still be alive. The Duke listened and gently said that actions born from good intentions don't always bring good results. But that wasn't her fault, since it had been the bird's own choice. He added that flying away had ultimately been the little bird's own decision. Vivian heard this but still felt a lingering unease. She wondered whether, if she had never let the bird experience the freedom of the outside world in the first place, it might have chosen to stay safely inside instead. The Duke suggested that even if the bird had been kept in a cage, it might have lived its whole life in resentment, forever yearning for the world outside. He advised her not to keep drowning in endless hypotheticals, but instead to look squarely at the reality of what had actually happened. In his view, the little bird had lived a good life, spending happy time by Vivian's side, and enjoying the freedom of the forest it truly belonged to. The Duke told her to learn to let go of a past that couldn't be changed, however sad it might be, since surely the little bird wouldn't want her trapped forever in painful memories. Vivian thanked him for his advice and unexpectedly asked whether the Duke himself had ever felt deep regret, which made him pause for a moment. The little girl expressed her wish to hear his story now, after he had patiently listened to hers. The Duke sighed, feeling it strange that he was about to pour his heart out to a mere child, then began to tell the story of the daughter he once had. Vivian realized he meant Isla, Rachel's mother, who, according to him, had lost her own mother early, but had still taken over caring for and looking after her father with all her heart. He had once considered his daughter his most precious treasure and had always longed to give her the very best the world had to offer. Yet he came to bitterly realize that what his daughter truly longed for was never material wealth or grandeur. She only wanted small, simple things, like the wildflowers she had always treasured. The Duke regretted having imposed what he thought was best upon his daughter, mistaking it for love. He remembered the sight of Isla kneeling before him, desperately begging him to save Leo Bright, the man she loved with all her heart. At the time, he had coldly dismissed her, believing there was no evidence to clear Leo Bright's name and fearing that helping him would make him complicit in treason. He had struck a bargain, offering his daughter the position of crown princess in exchange, and demanded she forget the man entirely. Isla had clutched her stomach and wept, while the Duke, at the time, had no idea his daughter was carrying the child of the king's own younger brother. In the end, the daughter who had once called him father decided to leave him behind in order to protect the small, precious life she carried. Only then did he come to the shocking realization that all this time, he hadn't been living for his children at all, but only for his own ambition and greed. Many years had passed, Yet the old father's remorse still ran deep. His daughter eventually returned to him together with Rachel, but she carried with her an incurable illness. The Duke tormented himself, wondering if he had respected his daughter's wishes back then, instead of forcing her to flee. Would things have turned out differently? He wondered whether, if not for the harshness of the past, that terrible illness would have been merciful enough to spare her, instead of taking her so soon. Vivian listened in silence to his pain. He bowed his head and admitted that even now he had never once stopped regretting that day. Vivian gently said that the young lady's mother had surely felt uncomfortable too, being forced by him to do things she didn't want to do. But the little girl believed every father had moments like that, and the Duke fell silent, waiting to hear what she would say next. She told him about her own father, who always made her take medicine even when she didn't want to, simply because he couldn't bear to see her sick. Or how he stopped her from climbing trees for fear she'd get hurt, even though she badly wanted to play. Despite occasionally being held back, Vivian affirmed she still loved her father very much. She smiled brightly and said it was her own fault for feeling that way, since she knew everything her father did came from his love for her. Vivian believed Rachel's mother had loved the Duke just as deeply, and that she would surely be saddened to see her father forever trapped in regret over the past. The Duke recalled his daughter once saying she had resented him greatly. His daughter had once admitted that saying she'd fully forgiven her father would be a lie. He remembered the moment at Isla's bedside. In his memory, he had bashfully apologized to his daughter. But Isla had taken his hand at the time and said that after becoming a mother herself, she had come to understand her father's pain. She believed her father had truly had no other choice back then, and she begged him to forgive himself from that moment on. The Duke gave a quiet murmur of acknowledgement, as though he had finally accepted the truth. He told himself it was time to let the memory of that child rest in peace. Meanwhile, Sally stared intently at the drawings in a notebook, her face full of fury. The little girl angrily flung things aside, wondering just what on earth her mother was doing to let things turn out this way. Sally wanted to drive Vivian away, growing angrier as she saw Vivian spending more and more time at the mansion. She shouted irritably for a snack and asked if there were any servants around. The eerie silence left Sally bewildered, and she called out again in frustration. She flung the door open in irritation, muttering nonstop about how annoying all this was. Sally couldn't believe that even the maids had started ignoring her, when before they would appear the instant she called. While stomping around in anger, Sally suddenly froze upon spotting a familiar figure in the distance. She realized it was Vivian and wondered why she was coming out of the Duke's study. Sally gritted her teeth, thinking Vivian had even managed to charm the Duke himself, and told herself she couldn't just leave this to her mother to handle anymore. Sally's eyes turned venomous as she resolved to find a way to drive Vivian out before things went too far. Back with Vivian, the little girl thought to herself that her plan was progressing even better than she'd hoped. Vivian reluctantly realized it was time to head home, arranging to meet Rachel again the day after tomorrow. Rachel wondered why it had to be the day after tomorrow instead of tomorrow. Vivian reminded her that tomorrow was her mother's death anniversary and asked if she planned to hold a memorial for her. Rachel fell silent for a long moment, then lowered her head and quietly said she wouldn't be doing that. Vivian worriedly promised not to bring it up again if it upset Rachel. Rachel hesitated, seemingly about to say something before stopping herself, which only made Vivian more curious. Finally, Rachel confessed she thought her grandfather wouldn't approve of her holding a memorial for her mother. Vivian was startled and asked why, telling Rachel that as her daughter, missing and remembering her mother was only natural. Rachel could only stay silent with a sorrowful look, remembering her grandfather's harsh words from the past. In Rachel's memory, her grandfather had once lamented that if only she had never existed, his daughter wouldn't have suffered so much or fallen ill like that. She remembered the image of the Duke collapsing by the door, anguished, believing Isla had ended up like this only because she'd tried to save that child. The young Rachel back then had stood frozen, wondering if her mother's illness truly had been her own fault. The haunting fear that she herself had been the one to kill her mother had clung to Rachel for all these years. Rachel, feeling worthless, believed her grandfather surely hated her, and though she was afraid of him too, she still felt guilty and didn't want to hold a memorial that would only sadden him further. Vivian looked at her friend with deep sorrow at this hidden pain. She earnestly asked Rachel to answer honestly whether, deep down, she truly wanted to see her mother or not. Rachel still hesitated before Vivian's direct question. After a long inner struggle, Rachel quietly spoke the truth from the depths of her heart. With eyes brimming with tears, she admitted that she truly, deeply wanted to see her mother. Vivian felt a pang of awkwardness at seeing the vulnerability of a friend who always tried to appear strong. She immediately grabbed Rachel's hand and suggested they go visit her mother right now, leaving Rachel bewildered as to how that could even be possible. Vivian asked about the portrait of Isla kept somewhere in the mansion, and Rachel told her it was currently in the gallery on the 4th floor. Vivian eagerly urged her friend to go right away, today. She reasoned that since the Duke wouldn't hold the ceremony until tomorrow, if they slipped away today, he'd never even know. Rachel gave a small nod of agreement, her eyes clearly showing a longing to finally act on this wish. Vivian cheered with joy, seeing that her friend had finally opened her heart. But then the little girl suddenly remembered that visiting the deceased required bringing flowers. Rachel suddenly recalled a particular flower her mother had loved dearly in life. It was called the mancha flower, a bloom found only in the South, and Rachel realized sadly that it could never grow here. Vivian immediately came up with the idea of making one herself out of paper, which left Rachel surprised and asking about it. Vivian asked about the flower's shape, and Rachel said there was surely an illustration of it in the library. Vivian urged Rachel to go find the picture while she went to check whether anyone was in the gallery. The two girls waved goodbye to each other and set off to carry out their secret plan. The mansion's hallway lay wrapped in stillness as the two children set their plan into motion. From the shadows, Sally was secretly watching, thinking to herself that Vivian was truly finished this time. Vivian let out a joyful cheer upon finally finishing her paper flowers. The little girl admired her handiwork proudly, wondering if she might just be a genius at paper folding, since it had turned out even better than she'd imagined. Rachel quietly approached and Vivian smiled, admitting that in truth Rachel had done most of the work herself. Vivian asked if Rachel was ready since the gallery was practically empty right now and it would be safe. The two children crept forward cautiously. Rachel opened the gallery door and confirmed there really was no one inside. They tiptoed in quietly, but suddenly Vivian jumped, startled by someone blocking her way. The nanny appeared out of nowhere and called Vivian's name, leaving the girl panicked and wondering why the woman had shown up at this exact moment. She demanded a private word, while Sally stood behind her with a triumphant smirk that gave Vivian an uneasy feeling. Vivian timidly asked the nanny if she had something important to discuss with her. Sally suddenly lunged forward, accusing Vivian of stealing something from the young lady, leaving the girl utterly bewildered. Rachel immediately stepped in to defend her friend, insisting Vivian had been by her side this entire time and hadn't done anything suspicious at all. Sally argued back that the two of them had separated earlier, and that was exactly when Vivian had supposedly snuck back into the room alone to commit the theft. Vivian firmly denied ever going back to the room, saying that by the time she returned, the young lady had already been there. Sally pressed further, asking if anyone had actually seen Vivian elsewhere at that time, insisting that since the 4th floor was so deserted, surely no one could have witnessed it. Vivian angrily retorted that she didn't need to prove her own innocence. It was Sally who needed to provide evidence. Sally immediately pointed straight at the bag Vivian was carrying. Vivian froze at being told to open her bag, feeling herself trembling with fear. She blamed herself for having been too preoccupied stuffing the flowers into her bag earlier to notice what else might be inside, and grew anxious about the secret paper flowers. Vivian worried that if she were exposed, she'd have to explain about the flowers, and her plan to sneak into the gallery would be completely blown. While Vivian was still flustered, Sally aggressively stepped forward to take matters into her own hands. Sally challenged her, saying if Vivian was so confident she should just show everyone, then roughly snatched the bag away from her. Sally turned the bag upside down, scattering everything inside across the floor for everyone to see. Among the paper flowers, a small object fell out and hit the floor with a dry clatter. Rachel was stunned to recognize it as her own hairpin, while Vivian was equally shocked, unable to understand how it had ended up in her bag. Vivian looked at the nanny and thought to herself, could this whole thing have been a trap set up in advance? The little girl bitterly realized the woman had staged this entire scheme to get rid of her, and wondered why she would be so malicious. Sally cried out triumphantly at having found the evidence, declaring with certainty that Vivian was a thief. She went on to mock the scraps of paper, claiming Vivian must have made them deliberately from the start just to hide the stolen hairpin. Whispers began to spread through the crowd as everyone looked at Vivian with suspicion, judging the little girl to be a conniving child. The nanny feigned disappointment, loudly asking why Vivian would do such a thing when the young lady had trusted her so completely. Vivian stood silently amid the accusations, feeling utterly alone and helpless. She tried to steady herself and think of a way to prove her innocence, but her mind was in complete turmoil, unsure what to say. What worried Vivian most was what Rachel would think, wondering if her closest friend could still trust her with such damning evidence against her. She feared Rachel would think she had been deceiving her all along, while the crowd around them buzzed with gossip. The maids and servants of the house began gathering, expressing shock and disappointment at what had just happened. In the midst of the intense tension, Vivian suddenly noticed everyone around her fall silent and part to either side. The little girl turned her head and saw the Duke's commanding presence right behind her. The Duke arrived just as Margaret was scolding Vivian, and he demanded to know why she was treating the child this way. Margaret explained that the girl had sneaked into the young lady's room and stolen something, and that she was conducting an inquiry to get to the bottom of it. The Duke kept his expression calm yet commanding, and asked the nanny if she had any concrete evidence, since he had no intention of condemning a child based on mere suspicion. Sally quickly stepped forward, holding out a hairpin, and insisted it had just been taken from Vivian's bag. The Duke took the hairpin, looked straight at Vivian, and asked in a low voice whether she had truly been the one to steal it. Vivian stood frozen, realizing she was utterly powerless with no way to prove her innocence at this moment. She could only tell herself to keep insisting this was unjust, when suddenly a voice rang out, declaring that she herself had been the one who gave it to Vivian. Vivian looked at Rachel in shock, unable to understand why her friend, who had always kept her distance, would choose to protect her in this situation. Rachel turned to Margaret and declared that she hadn't realized giving away her own personal belongings required the nanny's permission. Despite Margaret's attempts to lecture her about how a good friend should point out one another's faults, Rachel kept her cold expression. She affirmed her belief that a true friend is someone who stands by your side and helps you when you're facing injustice. Rachel continued, emphasizing that when a friend runs into trouble, the right thing to do is trust and help them, not turn your back and run. Vivian watched Rachel's retreating figure, an indescribable emotion welling up in her heart at hearing those firm words of defense. Sally angrily pointed at the pile of scraps that had fallen from the bag, demanding to know why Vivian was carrying around such garbage. Rachel quietly looked at the scraps of paper and explained they were flowers the two of them had made together, meant as an offering for her late mother. Vivian held her breath as Rachel explained she had put them in the bag to secretly bring to the gallery, fearing that if this truth came out, things would only get worse. The Duke, somewhat surprised, asked why the two children wanted to do this today instead of waiting until tomorrow. Rachel lowered her head and admitted she had thought her grandfather wouldn't approve if he saw her doing this. Watching Rachel's expression, the Duke's face suddenly shifted, carrying an unspoken emotion as he listened to his granddaughter's confession. He concluded that the matter was now clear and that Vivian had been completely wrongfully accused, and he ordered everyone to return to their posts. The steward turned to Sally and demanded she offer a proper apology for having nearly caused Vivian to suffer such an unjust accusation. Sally stood frozen, her eyes red with resentment and anger at seeing her scheme fall apart. The girl burst into tears and ran off, ignoring the nanny's calls behind her. Rachel watched her retreating figure, thinking to herself that people who set out to harm others from the very start could never truly feel genuine remorse. An awkward silence settled over the three of them, now that only the Duke and the two children remained in the hallway. Rachel urged Vivian to hurry along, since it was now far too late for her to stay at the mansion any longer. Vivian suddenly remembered something and asked to pause for a moment. She crouched down and began picking up the small items scattered across the floor, under the watchful eyes of the Duke and Rachel. Rachel approached and asked what Vivian was doing, and the girl replied she still wanted to gather everything up to bring these flowers to the young lady's mother. Rachel coldly told Vivian to just leave them and hurry up and go. The Duke looked at Rachel and unexpectedly asked if she would like to join him in the garden tomorrow. Seeing Rachel hesitate, he turned to Vivian too and asked her to come along with them as well. The next day, the atmosphere at the mansion felt slightly different as the memorial ceremony began. All three of them stood quietly before Isla's grave in the peaceful garden. Vivian gently knelt down and placed the carefully prepared bouquet of paper flowers on the stone altar. The small sound of the flowers being set down made the space feel even more still. Looking at the flower his daughter had once loved, the Duke thought to himself that Rachel must have been the one to tell Vivian about it. He realized this child had never stopped thinking of her mother and must have longed to visit her grave for a very long time. The Duke silently berated himself for being so foolish as to only realize this simple truth now. Noticing Rachel flinch slightly when he glanced her way, the Duke sensed the fear that still lingered in the child's eyes. Rachel avoided her grandfather's gaze, her heart still weighed down with old, unhealed pain. She recalled his bitter words from the past, when he had once wished she had never existed so her mother wouldn't have died. In Rachel's mind, the echo of her grandfather's anguished sobs from years ago rang out again, like a verdict pointed directly at her. His presence now made her chest tighten, each breath growing harder as she feared being cast aside. The Duke gently said that her mother would surely be happy to see her here, and expressed regret for not having brought her sooner. He admitted that he had always assumed she was afraid to see him, but in truth that had merely been his own cowardly excuse. The truth was he hadn't had the courage to face her because every time he looked at this face, he felt suffocated, believing he had indirectly caused his daughter's death. The Duke confessed that he had lived in regret his entire life for having let Isla leave under such circumstances. But only now did he realize that if he let this moment slip away too, his regret would become far too late to fix. He was filled with remorse for having let her grow up in such loneliness all these years. A sincere apology, spoken from the mouth of this powerful man, left Rachel utterly stunned, unable to believe her own ears. Standing beside her, Vivian felt a pang of sorrow hearing him call himself a foolish old man who had realized everything far too late. Rachel was confused, unsure how to respond, wondering if these were the very words she had longed to hear all this time. Or perhaps, deep down, she was still harboring a simmering anger that she couldn't quite name. Vivian softly called Rachel's name upon seeing her friend standing there, silent, without a word. The Duke rose to his feet, watching his granddaughter in silence with a patient, waiting look. Vivian stepped closer to the Duke and said the young lady didn't actually hate him at all. It was just an awkward feeling, similar to what she felt whenever she made up with her own father after an argument. She explained that since the young lady had endured her pain for so long, mending things would naturally take more time than usual. Seeing Vivian's encouraging smile, the Duke felt a bit lighter at heart. He smiled and affirmed he was willing to wait as long as it took, as long as this child needed time to open her heart. Vivian eagerly asked for permission to go find Rachel right away, since she had so much she wanted to share with her. Watching Vivian's small figure dash off into the mansion, the Duke stood quietly in the sunlit garden. He smiled softly, silently promising his daughter's spirit that from now on, they would all live well. The soft sound of Vivian's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. She found Rachel sitting curled up alone in a corner, looking small and isolated amid a pile of books. Vivian softly called her friend's name, wondering why Rachel was hiding here alone, looking so sad. Vivian asked if something was troubling her, or if she was still upset with her grandfather. She reminded Rachel that friends should share their hidden feelings with each other to ease their sorrow. Rachel looked up at her friend, her eyes showing clear conflict at that sincere offer. Rachel admitted quietly that she herself wasn't quite sure how she felt. She didn't know whether to feel happy or sad and had no idea what she truly wanted from her relationship with her grandfather. Rachel worried aloud whether Vivian could really understand a child as emotionally unstable and changeable as herself. Vivian smiled brightly. She promised to always stay by Rachel's side until the young lady truly understood her own feelings. The little girl affirmed that whether Rachel cried, laughed, or grew angry, she would always stand by her side because they were close friends. Rachel looked at Vivian, her heart overflowing with emotion, silently thanking fate for bringing this friend into her life. Sitting together in the library, Rachel thought to herself that she truly, deeply liked Vivian, a feeling that ran remarkably deep. Time passed quickly, and before long, 2 months had gone by since Rachel's mother's death anniversary, bringing with them many positive changes. One day, Rachel led Vivian down to the magic training room in the basement and began to reveal her greatest secret. Rachel demonstrated her hidden power and explained her body's unique ability to absorb mana from the surrounding environment. Even though these were details Vivian already knew from the original story, she still felt overwhelmed with happiness. That joy came from realizing Rachel had placed her complete trust in her by sharing this important secret. Still, Vivian also noticed some strange changes in Rachel's behavior lately. Rachel suddenly asked Vivian if she really hated boys, startling the girl, who firmly declared she only wanted to be friends with one particular person. Rachel looked at her friend's determined expression with a puzzled look, but seemed to feel more at ease after hearing that answer. The biggest change since that day had been in the relationship between the Duke and his granddaughter herself. The steward knocked on the door to announce that the Duke wished to invite them both to join him for afternoon tea. Rachel calmly agreed, and Vivian noticed the distance and wariness that used to fill the young lady's eyes had completely disappeared. The two children walked together down the hallway, Rachel no longer deliberately avoiding him anymore. On a night of pouring rain, Vivian suddenly heard a strange, humming sound echoing in her ears. She looked curiously around the dark room, wondering where exactly that sound was coming from amid the quiet night. Vivian moved closer to the window, her gaze drawn toward the dark forest wrapped in falling rain. She remembered the western forest was forbidden territory because monsters often appeared there, yet the call kept ringing on without pause. Vivian felt as though something invisible were ceaselessly beckoning her from deep within that mysterious forest. Rachel came over to check on her, startling Vivian, who quickly denied anything was wrong and urged her friend to hurry along. Taking one last look at the forest, Vivian reassured herself it was surely just her own overactive imagination. Noticing the rain falling heavily, the Duke told the two children to sit down and wait until it let up, and Rachel obliged quietly. Vivian suddenly felt flustered upon realizing she was holding the young lady's hand, wondering if such an intimate gesture in front of the Duke might be seen as improper. Even after letting go on her own, Vivian still felt restless, sensing the Duke's gaze fixed on her for reasons she couldn't quite place. The Duke remarked that it rained a great deal in the south, quite unlike the north where he used to live, which saw very little rain even in summer. Vivian chimed in, sharing that she loved rainy days, since the sound of rain usually helped her fall asleep easily. Still, the little girl secretly hoped it wouldn't rain on the day of the upcoming festival. When the Duke asked about it, Vivian eagerly described the summer festival held every year, about 2 weeks from now. She described it as a wonderfully fun occasion when everyone dressed up as ghosts and spirits, selling all sorts of delicious food. With sparkling eyes, Vivian gathered her courage and asked if she might be allowed to attend the festival together with Lady Rachel. The Duke asked whether that was really what Rachel herself wanted, while Vivian quickly chimed in, insisting the young lady was just as eager to go. Watching Vivian's expression, the Duke suspected she was simply pleading hard to drag her friend along, and Vivian flinched, caught red-handed. She recalled how she had thrown her arms around Rachel to persuade her to come along, only for Rachel to demand she let go at once. Rachel, still keeping her usual composed air, quietly confirmed that she truly wanted to attend the festival. The Duke smiled and agreed, telling the two children to go have a wonderful time, which sent Vivian leaping with joy as she praised him as the most wonderful person ever. The Duke chuckled quietly at Vivian's flattery, then unexpectedly asked about her father running a bakery, mentioning that the household chef was in need of an assistant. Vivian was taken aback to hear he was considering hiring her father to work at the mansion, if he agreed. She quietly calculated that this was an incredibly generous gesture, since the Duke's household could easily have found someone far more skilled than her father. Thinking that a servant's wages at the mansion would surely be much higher than what the bakery brought in, Vivian felt this was an enormous opportunity to change their fortunes. Yet, contrary to the Duke's expectations, Vivian bowed her head in thanks and politely declined the tempting offer. The Duke pressed her for the reason, and Vivian looked incredibly hesitant and flustered. Finally, the little girl confessed something rather odd, that her father truly had no talent whatsoever for baking or cooking. Vivian felt that although she herself was a little greedy, her conscience simply wouldn't let her allow her father to wreak havoc in the mansion's kitchen. The Duke was surprised, since children usually boasted about their fathers, especially in front of others. He laughed and said Vivian's answer only made him more curious to try her father's baking for himself. The Duke asked further whether her father was skilled or passionate about anything else, which left Vivian pausing to think about what her father was actually good at. That night at the bakery, Vivian froze in horror at the sight of her father's latest creation fresh out of the oven. Her father cheerfully urged his daughter to try the new bread he had poured days of effort into perfecting. Vivian looked in horror at the steaming deep purple loaves and asked her father exactly what he had put into them. She recognized it was bread but couldn't fathom what he'd done to turn it such a bizarre shade of blue. Her father proudly explained he'd added herbs and food coloring, thinking plain bread would look far too boring otherwise. Vivian closed her eyes and took a bite under her father's expectant gaze. When asked how it tasted, she thought it tasted like a bitter medicine she'd be furious about if it didn't actually make her healthier. Vivian shuddered, realizing the two of them would never be able to survive on this bakery for long with her father's skills as they were. Worried she might have been too harsh and hurt her father's feelings, Vivian told herself she should at least try to finish one whole loaf. She gathered her courage and asked her father if he'd like to come work at the Duke's mansion as a servant. Her father asked in surprise, while Vivian tried her best to convince him of the benefits of such a job. She hoped her father could earn more money and that the two of them could live in a grand, luxurious mansion. However, her father replied solemnly that he had no wish for his life to belong to someone else, since that would be an incredibly dull and miserable existence. His expression turned serious as he spoke about the value of freedom. He wrapped Vivian in a hug and declared that he preferred their current peaceful life, just the two of them, over anything else. Her father gently stroked his daughter's head and praised her for growing up enough to worry about him. He suddenly remembered Vivian hadn't had dinner yet and urged her to hurry and eat the hot soup he'd just finished making. Vivian shuddered once again upon hearing her father reveal he'd also poured the leftover herbs from the bread into the soup. Feeling as though her fate had been sealed by her father's bizarre taste, Vivian could only resign herself with a sigh, declaring she was truly doomed. During the meal, her father asked what Vivian had learned at the mansion that day. Vivian replied she had studied history and admitted she was gradually getting used to her father's cooking, then asked which part of the lesson he wanted to hear about. The little girl thought for a moment, trying to recall the name of the main figure from that history lesson. The instant the name Denzel Sweet left her lips, her father suddenly choked and spat out his water. Vivian asked in alarm if her father was okay, startled by such a strong reaction to a single name. She hurried to fetch him some water, worrying nonstop about his condition. After he'd calmed down, Vivian still couldn't help but wonder about her father's strange reaction. She asked if he knew anything about a man named Denzel Sweet. Her father replied quietly that the man was quite famous, so of course he knew of him. Vivian enthusiastically praised Denzel Sweet as a truly great and wonderful hero of the Empire. She recalled her lesson about the world, home to a demon race capable of wielding powerful magic. The war between humans and demons raged on endlessly as the demons constantly attacked and plundered human settlements. 10 years earlier, the Emperor had planned an expedition into demon territory to protect his people. Denzel Sweet, the youngest master swordsman in history, had led that expedition. Despite fighting on unfavorable terrain, he had continued winning battle after battle against the demon legions. But during one sudden ambush, he ordered his subordinates to retreat while he stayed behind alone to fight, ultimately giving his life. Since his body was never found, he was recorded as missing, and the demon attacks eventually subsided after that. It was precisely because of that sacrifice that the Empire's people had always honored him and called him a hero. Her father asked what Vivian thought of that hero, believing that at her age anyone would naturally admire such a figure. Vivian declared he was truly awesome, but her father looked at her with a hint of doubt. She passionately described his courage, willing to sacrifice his own life for the sake of his men. Her father looked at his daughter with a hint of sorrow and quietly said that perhaps the man wasn't quite as awesome as everyone believed. He explained that history is always written by the victors, so it only ever reflects their point of view. He put forward the idea that perhaps the demons had actually been the kind ones, and humans the true villains, but the truth had been twisted. Her father warned Vivian not to hate all demons just because of what was written in books, since there is good and evil everywhere. Struck by her father's insight, Vivian curiously asked if he had ever met a kind demon himself. Her father gave a quiet nod, confirming he had met some, back before the gate to the demon realm was sealed shut. Vivian recalled that 6 years earlier, the Demon King had sealed off all the passages leading into the demon territory. Her father confided that back then, he too had simply believed what he'd been taught, and once thought that person was evil, only to regret it later. Vivian nodded in agreement with her father, and promised she would judge for herself whether a person was good or bad, rather than trusting rumors. Her father smiled and praised his daughter for being just as clever and kind-hearted as her mother had been long ago. As night fell late, her father came into her room to ask if Vivian was ready to go to sleep. Vivian sat quietly by the window, gazing up at the vast, starry sky with a thoughtful look on her face. Her father noticed his daughter seemed to be hiding some worry, trying not to burden him with it. He called her name softly once more to find out what was going on. He gently said that even if it wasn't anything serious, she should still share it with her father. Vivian hesitated, saying it might sound strange, but she kept feeling as though the forest were constantly calling out to her. Upon learning it was the Western Forest, her father asked if she'd heard someone's voice specifically, but Vivian denied it. She felt it was the forest itself calling to her, not any particular person. Her father gazed thoughtfully out the window at this strange confession. He worried aloud whether his forbidding her had only made her want to go into the forest more, but Vivian insisted she was actually quite afraid of the monsters inside it. Her father told her she must never, under any circumstances, set foot in that forest, and Vivian obediently agreed. He tucked Vivian into bed and told her to hurry and go to sleep. Her father gently kissed her forehead, silently wishing her the sweetest of dreams. Once Vivian had fallen fast asleep, her father stood quietly by the window, gazing up at the night sky, lost in thought. In truth, the Emperor's men had recently been secretly scouring every forest, searching for places where the barrier's magic had grown weak. Their true purpose wasn't to protect the people, but to find a way into the demon realm in order to seize the Demon King's heart. The Demon King's heart was said to hold a colossal amount of mana, something any power-hungry being would desperately want to obtain. With an emperor forever consumed by his lust for power and his jealousy of Leo Bright, his hunger for the Demon King's heart was almost inevitable. The man stood pensively by the window, thinking to himself that when the demon realm's gate had closed, he had assumed that person would give up, but it seemed he still hadn't let go. His face darkened slightly as he thought of the coming summer festival, realizing his young daughter must be eagerly looking forward to it. He recalled that the last time he had set foot in that forest was all the way back in March, his legs still seeming to remember the chill of that day. That had been just days before Duke Edie officially arrived in this land, and he flipped through his stack of calendar pages, pausing meaningfully on the date of the 14th. Beneath the full round moon, the man told himself it was time to go verify the truth of everything once more. Meanwhile, Margaret stood trembling behind a door, staring in shock at the words describing a sentence of hard labor for life reserved for the son of a traitor. She was stunned by the chilling threats written on the page, a devastating secret slowly coming to light. Overwhelming fear gripped Margaret's mind as she realized someone seemed to have caught wind of the truth about Rachel's real gender. The note further warned that if she failed to meet him at the inn, the Duke would soon learn that it was her own daughter, Sally, who had leaked the young lady's secret. Margaret recalled an earlier conversation when an impatient Sally had asked her mother when they could finally drive Vivian away from this place. Sally had even worried that if things continued this way, Vivian would eventually end up marrying Rachel, a thought that left Margaret utterly stunned. She had rushed over in a panic to grab hold of Sally, scolding her daughter for speaking so recklessly about such a forbidden topic. Sally could only stammer an explanation that she'd only said it out of frustration at seeing Vivian constantly hovering around Rachel. Margaret sternly warned that if anyone else ever overheard such words, both mother and daughter would face certain death. Back in the present, Margaret worried anxiously over who could have sent this letter and what their true purpose might be. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled Margaret. She took a breath to steady herself. A servant entered and reported that a mysterious man had asked them to deliver this note to her. Cold sweat ran down Margaret's face as she realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Realizing Sally had already been dragged into this whirlpool, Margaret decided she had to go meet this man at once to try to salvage things. A hushed night settled over the remote inn, where a fateful meeting was about to take place. Margaret wrapped herself in a cloak to hide her face and slipped cautiously inside the inn. She stood before the door and quietly asked if this was where the man was waiting for her. A cold voice from within called out, telling her to simply come inside. The moment the door opened, Margaret froze at the sight of the man standing there, waiting for her. He turned to her with an enigmatic smile, asking how life in the countryside had been treating her lately. Margaret was stunned to recognize him as the Emperor's own inspector, the man who had visited the mansion to snoop around months earlier. She understood that if this man was here, it meant the Emperor had surely already learned Rachel's secret. She collapsed to the floor, begging for mercy and swearing she had never once intended to deceive His Majesty. She wept, pleading that she had only wanted to raise the fatherless child as best she could, but he brushed her off, uninterested in any sob story. He declared that the Emperor wanted this matter resolved quietly and discreetly. A chilling silence fell over the room as Margaret understood she had no choice but to handle everything herself if she wanted to survive. A cruel plan was laid out. The young lady would die in an unfortunate accident while vacationing with her grandfather. He looked at her with a menacing gaze, asking what someone who harbored a traitor's child would have to do to survive in this situation. The next morning, Vivian stood in front of the closed bakery, thinking about how hard her father worked. She told herself she was a mature 9-year-old who understood the hearts of parents well. Vivian generously reasoned that her father deserved some time to rest and go out with friends instead of always being tied down by his child. Yet the little girl suddenly flared up in anger at the thought of her father choosing exactly the time of the upcoming festival, right when the bakery was doing brisk business to go away. Vivian grumbled to herself that her father was probably just trying to sneak off and have fun with friends, abandoning her chance to make good money. During the meal, her father asked if Vivian remembered Uncle Mark, though she admitted she'd never even met the man. He gave a rather sorrowful-sounding excuse about a friend's relative having just passed away, insisting he absolutely had to go pay his respects. Vivian looked at her father with utter distrust, thinking to herself that this whole story sounded completely made up. Her father promised to return on the last day of the festival and began packing his bags to set off. He told Vivian not to skip meals, to remember to wash her hands after playing, and not to forget to brush her teeth before bed. Vivian shot back her own warnings, telling him not to drink too much, not to get into mischief, and to stay far away from scary men. Her father laughed and wondered aloud who exactly was the parent here, then urged Vivian to hurry up and answer him. He patted Vivian's cheek and told her to behave and have fun with Lady Rachel while he was away. At the mansion, Vivian's father bowed his head, apologizing for the trouble and entrusting his daughter to the Duke's household staff. Vivian thought to herself that while her father was away, she would stay at Rachel's mansion just as planned. She recalled her original plan had been to stay at the general store instead, but Rachel had intervened. Vivian had casually mentioned that the general store was Peter's home, so staying there was only natural. Rachel immediately and firmly objected, leaving Vivian utterly bewildered as to why. Rachel explained seriously that boys and girls over the age of 8 absolutely could not sleep under the same roof. Vivian pointed out that they'd each have separate rooms, but Rachel remained adamant that Peter wasn't a good boy. The little girl suddenly leaned in close and teased her, asking if Rachel was jealous, worried she might grow close to Peter instead. Seeing Rachel flustered, Vivian smiled brightly and reassured her friend that she still liked Rachel best of all. Rachel abruptly stood up and suggested Vivian stay at her own mansion instead of going elsewhere. Rachel pointed out that the mansion had plenty of empty guest rooms, which began to sway Vivian toward accepting the offer. Vivian thought staying at the mansion would be safe, save her a long trip back and forth, and best of all, she'd have her friend right there with her, so she decided to agree at once. In the end, Vivian moved into the Duke's mansion exactly as Rachel had wished. She waved goodbye to her father, feeling thoroughly excited. Vivian eagerly imagined staying up late with Rachel and having fun pillow fights together. The little girl beamed with delight, feeling that getting to stay over at her friend's house was truly a wonderful and special thing. That night, Vivian and Rachel sat together playing chess with great enthusiasm in the quiet room. But before long, Vivian began to feel sleepy and couldn't stop yawning over the chessboard. Rachel suddenly stood up and announced she was heading back to her own room, leaving Vivian disappointed and asking if she wasn't going to sleep here. Rachel pointed out that this room was meant specifically for Vivian, while the girl wondered why friends couldn't just sleep together. Rachel kept a serious expression and explained that sleeping in the same room before marriage would violate proper etiquette and manners. Vivian reminded her that they were both girls, so there was really nothing at all to worry about. Rachel's face turned bright red as she flatly refused and hurriedly stood up to leave right away. Vivian chased after her, pleading and asking if it was really true they couldn't sleep in the same room. She put on her most pitiful look to try to persuade her, worried this might be the only chance they'd ever get to be this close together. Rachel stood silently before the door, her eyes betraying clear hesitation at Vivian's plea. But in the end, Rachel remained firm and said no, leaving Vivian completely stunned by the flat refusal. The door shut with a cold good night, leaving Vivian standing alone, dazed, in the hallway. Vivian fumed, wondering why Rachel had insisted she stay here in the first place, only to make her sleep alone after all. The little girl huffed and flopped onto the bed, muttering nonstop about what a fool Rachel was. Still, she had to admit this bed was remarkably soft and far more comfortable than the one back home. Vivian told herself she'd fall asleep the moment she closed her eyes, but a strange, unfamiliar call suddenly echoed in her ears. She jolted awake in the middle of the night, feeling as though something were persistently calling out her name. Vivian looked around the dark hallway in fright, trying to find the source of that mysterious sound. Trembling, she asked whatever was calling her what it was and why it kept bothering her in the dead of night. Vivian stood by the window, staring out at the pitch-black forest, but received no answer at all. Fear began to make her wonder if she was losing her mind or facing something truly frightening. Vivian wondered if it was the voice of a spirit or a demon, a voice that seemed to be heard by no one but her. Her small legs trembled with overwhelming fear as it slowly closed in on her in the empty silence. Vivian burst into tears on the bed, softly calling out for her father in vain as she faced her fear all alone. A faint light led Vivian to Rachel's door, and she timidly knocked, still trembling with fear. She thought Rachel was probably already fast asleep, which only made the little girl feel more lonely and pitiful than ever. The door suddenly opened, startling Vivian, and Rachel appeared with a puzzled look, asking what was wrong. With tearful eyes, Vivian confessed she was terrified of sleeping alone and asked to sleep with her friend. Rachel looked silently at Vivian's pitiful expression, then quietly told her to come into her room. The two of them climbed into the large bed together, and Vivian felt much safer with Rachel by her side. Vivian timidly asked if they could leave the light on tonight instead of turning it off. Rachel replied that she planned to read for a while before sleeping, so she told Vivian to just go ahead and sleep first. Rachel sat on the bed, absorbed in her book, creating a peaceful, warm atmosphere for Vivian. Vivian realized Rachel had deliberately kept the light on to ease her fear, and her heart suddenly felt sweet, as if filled with cotton candy. Looking at Rachel, Vivian thought perhaps it was time she honestly told her friend about everything she'd been going through. Vivian softly called out to Rachel, admitting that she kept feeling like something was calling out to her. Rachel asked, puzzled, about that calling. Vivian replied that only she could sense it, and it frightened her. She wondered if she was going crazy. Rachel affirmed that Vivian was certainly a strange one, prompting the girl to let out a small protest. However, Rachel went on to say that perhaps it wasn't that Vivian was strange, but rather that she was quite special. Hearing Vivian's confusion, Rachel explained that exorcists often hear the voices of evil spirits, and some elemental mages can also hear the calls of spirits. Vivian suddenly remembered that yes, such people did exist. She thought to herself that if that were true, then she wasn't crazy after all, but actually possessed some special ability. Rachel asked if she could still hear it now. Vivian said no, but she worried the call would start up again once everything grew quiet. Vivian asked Rachel to keep talking with her until she fell back asleep, but Rachel hesitated, unsure what to say at that moment. Vivian thought to herself that the request was probably a bit much, since Rachel wasn't exactly the talkative type. Suddenly, Rachel began humming a melody, which surprised Vivian and made her ask about it. Vivian asked what song it was. Rachel replied it was a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, though she no longer remembered the words clearly. Noticing Rachel ask if she didn't like the song, Vivian quickly praised it as lovely and sweet, adding that her friend's voice was beautiful too. Rachel blushed slightly and remarked that Vivian always praised everything. Vivian replied that she called it beautiful because it truly was beautiful. Then she wondered if describing a voice that way sounded strange, since sound couldn't be seen with the eyes. Vivian explained that even though you couldn't see it, you could still feel it. She compared Rachel's voice to the sound of leaves dancing in the wind. She added that it was like the wind blowing through a summer forest, making it sound truly beautiful. Rachel listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. Vivian privately thought that Rachel's voice had seemed cold and composed at first, but was actually quite gentle, like leaves swaying softly in the breeze. Rachel gave a small laugh and asked what exactly that comparison was supposed to mean. Feeling her mind finally relax, Vivian suddenly felt drowsiness creeping over her. She told herself she had to say this before drifting completely into deep sleep. Vivian softly thanked Rachel as the two children lay side by side in the quiet room. Rachel smiled gently, silently wishing Vivian a good night's sleep. The next morning, the Duke instructed Owen to keep a close watch over the mansion and especially Rachel while he traveled to the capital, and Owen happily agreed. When Owen asked when he'd be back, the Duke said it was hard to say, but even if he rushed, he'd likely only make it back by the end of the festival. Owen ventured to suggest that perhaps he should come home a little earlier to spend more time with his granddaughter. The Duke asked if the two children were already awake, and Owen replied they still seemed to be asleep, then mentioned that Vivian had gone to sleep in the young lady's room the night before. The Duke smiled, saying that perhaps it was better for an old man like himself to step aside for Rachel's sake. Owen suddenly asked if he had already chosen his future granddaughter-in-law, catching the Duke off guard. The Duke fell silent for a moment before declaring firmly that he would set off at once. Walking down the hallway, he thought to himself that if the two children wished it someday, he wouldn't consider any difference in status a problem. What mattered most right now was that everyone still saw Rachel as a girl. The Duke worried quietly whether it was truly wise to send that child out into such a dangerous world when this secret couldn't be hidden forever. He told himself there was no need to worry too much just yet, since nothing had become clear at this point. Vivian's sudden call made the Duke stop in his tracks right at the door. The two children hurried down the stairs. Standing before him, Vivian politely wished the Duke a safe journey. Rachel placed a hand over her chest to steady herself and shyly wished her grandfather a safe trip. The Duke looked at the two children and asked if they needed anything or wanted any particular food. Rachel glanced at Vivian, then quietly said she didn't really need anything. Vivian quickly spoke up, requesting dessert, saying she wanted to try the most delicious, famous treat in the capital. The Duke patted Vivian's head, promising to try his best, silently thinking she really did resemble Isla. He turned to ask Rachel once more if she was truly sure she didn't need anything for herself. Rachel glanced at Vivian before hesitantly asking him to bring back some more books, specifically the magic books he always brought her. The Duke realized Rachel had likely said that only so as not to disappoint him further, rather than truly needing them right now. He patted Rachel's head and told her he would be back soon. As the Duke departed, the two girls stood watching from the doorway, and he felt for the first time in a long while a genuine longing to come home. The Duke told himself he absolutely had to return to this mansion, while Vivian invited Rachel to head back inside with her. The two children walked along chatting happily, unaware that a pair of eyes was quietly watching them. The nanny stood still, her face heavy with gloom, as she watched the two girls' retreating figures.